Science Board and the courts have reviewed and approved broadcasting this meeting with video and audio on cable TV and on the web. The board attorney has opined that the public access provided by this technology makes this virtual meeting reasonably accessible to the public and provides appropriate opportunity to observe the conduct of the board's workshop, consistent with prevailing best practices during this emergency situation, and therefore complies with the Open Meetings Act. We will now start with a roll call. Ms. Antwine.
Here.
Mr. Silkworth.
Here.
Ms. Frank.
Here.
Ms. Ellis.
Present.
Ms. Schallheim.
Here.
Ms. Tobin.
Here.
And Mr. Smith.
Here.
Our workshops are designed for the Board of Education to interact and have conversations with the board staff on particular topics of interest. At this time, I'm going to ask Ms. Ellis to say a couple words of introduction, as Ms. Ellis has been our point person for the board on this very important topic and has guided us and nurtured us throughout, including being instrumental in preparing for this workshop as well as the upcoming public hearing. Ms. Ellis, please.
Thank you, President Corkadell. Good evening, everyone. Just a brief reminder of why we are doing this. We had scheduled this workshop for, I believe it was this past summer, and COVID had other ideas. We had to focus our attention on preparing for the new school year. But the purpose of tonight is to look at where we are on this issue and see and really focus our attention on seeking solutions. Dr. Arlotto, I believe, will go over a history of this topic, beginning with the Start Times Task Force that began, I believe, in 2013. Throughout the time since then, there have been 3 surveys. The first one indicating that majority of stakeholders, particularly parents and I believe students, wanted a change. The second survey did not indicate a desire for the proposed solutions at that time. But a more recent survey conducted by the transportation consultant, Prismatic, did indicate that people still see a need or a reason for change. And this evening, so the purpose of this evening is not to investigate should we or why should we. There's a whole host of resources that is available to board members that they were able to access and use to prepare for tonight's meeting that gives the whole background. There's a tremendous amount of science about why this topic is important, about the physical needs of students, and how supporting those needs results in academic success as well. So the purpose tonight is to dig into what are the moving parts, what is it we need to tackle and perhaps overcome to get us to that place where we have healthy start times for all students. So that being said, I guess I'll turn it back to President Corkadell, who I believe will turn it over to Dr. Arlotto.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ellis. Great introduction. So I'm so
sorry. I did forget to say one thing.
Sure.
I'm still having trouble getting back and forth on my screens, but If Mr. Mosier will share at some point on the screen, there is a web page. I believe it's aacps.org/start times. I'm not sure if that's the exact website, but that has all of those materials that the board is able to review.
Yeah, yes, ma'am, and I'll reference that in my remarks.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. So I don't think we need too much more introduction. I just want to lay out a couple of ground rules for the benefit of not just as a refresher for the board members, but also for the benefit of the public. Dr. Alvado and his staff will be making a presentation, providing additional information, refreshing on information that some members may already know, but for the benefit of our new members, as well as a newly engaged public. And then at that time, Dr. Alvado and his staff will manage the board's questions in roll call order. And I'm just going to allow Dr. Alvado just to go ahead and call those out. I would ask that members please limit it to a genuine 2 questions per member. We want to make sure that each and every single district has appropriate representation throughout all of these meetings. And so the roll call order that you were called in to affirm your attendance is what we will be using tonight. So I'll ask everyone to put on their listening hats. Isn't that an old phrase that they used to use? Caps during this information session. And then I'll also remind the board members that if there are follow-up questions that you think of after the workshop, by all means, please feel free to coordinate through Ms. Howell to reach out. And we do want to encourage the use of our communications log because it allows all board members to see the answers to your questions that they may have also wanted to receive, but didn't even know it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Alvado. And as I just said, as a reminder, 2 questions, try not to make them too compounded, the questions. We will take, of course, multiple rounds to make sure that all members have an equal opportunity to have all of their questions answered. So Dr. Alvado, I want to first thank you and your staff. I know that these conversations that have been ongoing for at least a decade here in Anne Arundel County have taken on their own sort of light. And I know it's important also for us to recognize how we got here and what we need to do to move forward in a conversation that ironically a lot support, but operationally has always been very challenging to you and your staff. So I greatly appreciate the extra work and the commitment to think outside of the box of some of those traditional practices to get us moving forward in this conversation. Thank you very much, sir. And you now have the table.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Madam Vice President, for the introduction. So we are, of course, delighted to spend some time with you this evening. This is going to be, I hope, useful information. As was referenced, and as you know, we sent you a number of documents in advance of tonight's meeting so that you could go through them. Many of them for our previous board members you will be familiar with. For our newest board members, and welcome Ms. Frank and Dr. Tobin and Mr. Silkworth to this first official meeting as members of the Board of Education. Welcome to Team AACPS. So we sent the information for you to begin to review in advance. There's no way you're going to be able to go through all of that and truly understand it all in such a very short period of time. So that's part of what tonight is about. I'm going to go through some introductory remarks and share a timeline dating back to February of 2013. And then we're going to move forward and share some other information about routing and scheduling of buses and a tiered system, just so that the entire board now, this now acting body, will be at least somewhat on the same page as far as knowledge and information in this area, as it relates directly to Anne Arundel County Public Schools and start and dismissal times. Before I get into those remarks, let me welcome our guests and make sure that the Board of Education knows who's joined us this evening for this workshop to assist in answering your questions and moving your knowledge forward on this important topic. First, let me thank and welcome Mr. Rick Anthony. Mr. Anthony is the Director of Recreation and Parks for Anne Arundel County. He is a longtime partner of ours. We have an incredible partnership with our Department of Recreation and Parks. They really coordinate, among many things, coordinate significant use of our buildings when school is not in session. And that certainly includes youth sports that utilize both the inside and outside of our buildings, our fields, as well as childcare. So Mr. Anthony has joined us. He's going to have some remarks for you and will be available to answer questions in those rooms. Rick, thank you so much for being here. You're awesome. Mr. Les Douglas, our Supervisor of Transportation, who you know well, has joined us this evening, as has Ms. Wanda McIntyre. She's one of our area specialists, really knows the routing process well. She's brilliant. She was also, if I'm not mistaken, one of the members of the task force representing transportation at that time back in 2014. So she's joining us this evening. We also have Mr. Clayton Culp, who's our coordinator of athletics, along with Mr. Brian Lehman, who is our specialist in athletics. And Brian, again, if I'm not mistaken, was part of the task force representing athletics. I'll talk a little bit more about the task force in a little bit, but he was part of that group way back in 2014. So thank you, Clayton and Brian, for being part of this evening's workshop and making yourselves available. Again, I'm going to go through a fairly brief presentation, again, because I think it's important that this now new body with our new members are all sort of at least as much as we can on the same page with regard to knowledge as it relates to this important topic with Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Let me take a quick look at my notes. So with that, let me begin with a timeline dating back to February 28th, 2013. Many of you will recognize this graphic as it's the front cover of a report of our school hours. And there was a study done, and that was done again back and released back in 2013 under the direction of then Superintendent Kevin Maxwell. That followed, fast forward to December of 2013, and this school hour study was presented publicly to the board, again, under the direction of a different superintendent, Mrs. Mamie Perkins, who was the interim superintendent at that time, and that was December of 2013. Moving forward to February of 2014, and this is when, under the direction of interim superintendent Mamie Perkins, was the formation of a 15-person task force to start and dismissal times. And several of the folks that are on this evening's workshop were part of that. Also included for tonight for the board is Dr. Maureen McMahon, who worked on that start and dismissal times task force. Mrs. Monique Jackson is joining us, as is Mr. Shaq Novich, are all joining us this evening. Part of the work of the school start and dismissal times task force was a great deal of research and review of the scientific and other literature on this topic. All of that information was posted to a website that we created that has been in existence since then. So it was created then in February 2014. And after each meeting minutes, notes, any information that was shared with the task force at the time, including research, was posted to this website. And that website has been active since then. We have never taken it down. We have updated it on occasion as more information has come in, but that is still available for all to see, and that information was passed on to the board in that tranche of information that was sent to you to review to prepare for this evening's workshop. Fast forward to October of 2014, and the task force presented to the Board of Education at the time, and there were 4 options in the possible shifting of start times, and that was in October of 2014, and that was now in fast forwarding to now yet a 3rd superintendent during this process, and that was yours truly. Also in conjunction with that was a survey that was put together, and the results of that survey was also shared back in December of 2014. And then also in December of 2014, and this was my first budget presented as a superintendent, I recommended to the board at that time that we include a little over $700,000 for the acquisition of a bus routing software as well as an analyst. This was part of my first budget. It was a recommendation of the task force at the time, and I included it in my first budget recommendation. Luckily, the county council went through the process. The board approved, and the county council approved that during that time. In February of 2015, the board added. So now the board has had time to go through the recommendations of the budget, and the board added roughly $602,000 to support a shift in school start times. That would begin no later than the 2016-2017 school year. That also was approved by the county council in that budget year. In June of 2015, the board directed me as superintendent to reserve that $602,000 as needed in preparation for start time. So we didn't use it in that budget, but I was asked to hold that money for the future, which we did. In December of 2015, now as it relates to the second budget that I presented as a superintendent, I recommended $8.1 million to the Board of Education in the adoption of the task force option A that would begin in August of 2017. So for this 2017-2018 school year, of course, that was pending full county funding, but certainly broad community support. But that was part of the second budget that my team built, as a superintendent. And you may have already reviewed those options, but in quick reference point, that option A would have had high school starting at 8:30 and ending at 3:18. Middle schools would have started no earlier than 9:30 and no later than 4:15. And elementary schools would have started between 7:50 and 9:15 and ended between 2:15 and 3:40. That was option A, and what we budgeted for and worked to roll out at that time. So then, after presenting that option to the board, we planned for a series of 4 workshops in 4 different locations around the board. Unfortunately, weather only allowed us to host and complete 3 of those workshops in February of 2016. I was lucky enough to present to the public at hand at each one of those. For those of you that attended and participated in those, we did a presentation, sort of a town hall style presentation by me in the auditorium of each of those high schools. And then we adjourned those participants to the cafeterias where we had breakout sessions. We had facilitators for each of those breakout groups and note takers to get public feedback on that option A. And as I said, we were able to conduct 3 of those 4 workshops. Moving forward, so that was in February, early part of February 2016, moving forward to now February of 2016, where the board was finalizing, reviewing my request and finalizing their budget that they were going to move forward to the county executive The board at the time did not agree with the $8.1 million recommendation, removed that recommendation and added $1.4 million for future use in some school system, in some school hours initiative, though no specific plan was given at that time of the budget finalization for the board. In March of 2016, the board asked for plans utilizing the $600,000 from, remember, that FY 2016 budget, as well as one using the $1.4 million should that become part of the budget and make it past and be supported by the county executive and county council at the time. In April of 2016, my team presented three options, two that were at that roughly $600,000 mark, and one at the $1.4 million mark. And you will note and remember, for those of you that were following along, that the $1.4 million request ultimately was not approved by the county council or the county executive during that budget year. In September of 2016, the board voted to shift the 2017-2018 start and dismissal times. The high school start times, the shift was, if you remember, we were starting at 7:17 and we would move that forward 13 minutes to a 7:30 start time for all high schools. The elementary and middle schools, as well as the special schools, shifted by approximately 15 to 20 minutes. That figure that was just a little over $600,000 had grown now a year and a half later, based on the economy, had grown to $618,000. But we used that money to purchase an additional 10 buses so that we could implement this shift in start times for high schools, elementary schools, middles, as well as our special schools. So that's just a brief rendition. You have that information in what was sent to you. And much of that is on the website as well for the public to review. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the team, who's going to talk a little about school hours, chronology, as well as scheduling buses, and talk a little bit about the tiered system. Les?
Hi, this is Les Douglas. I want to start right at the beginning, the fundamentals of routing. There are really three phases in routing buses. The first is creating bus stops. And that portion of the process is primarily a safety function. It has very little to do with efficiency. We just want to make sure that we place these stops in a location where we've accounted for those things that we look for in a safe bus stop. The second phase is combining those stops into trips that would go to a single school. And combining them into trips has less to do with safety. Once the kids are on the bus, we're thinking more about the efficiency of the bus. And where we can gain efficiency in building trips is in ensuring that the bus is filled not so much to capacity, but to an optimum capacity. We run into quite a few problems in the transportation office when you have 2 or 3 more kids than you need, or 10 more kids than is appropriate on a bus. And in that case, you want to try to find another place for these 10 students. But really, the efficiency is found in creating trips, in putting the appropriate number of students on the bus. And this might sound simple, but if you have a rural area, it might take an hour and a half to fill the bus. Southern High School, and I believe I have these figures correct, it's about 88 square miles for that one high school, as opposed to Severna Park that has 13 square miles. It's very, very easy to fill a bus in Severna Park by having a 20-minute route. In Southern High School, you may have to go an hour or more to fill the bus. So there are two trade-offs here. It's fill the bus as full as is possible, but you also want to keep in mind how much time it takes to do that. So those are two parameters in building trips to try to reach optimum efficiency. And then the third combination is combining trips into a route, so that once you create these trips, you want to combine them in such a way that the bus can serve 3 or 4 schools. And this really has the tiering process. And when we hear tiering, it means that combining trips into a route. That's where really your greatest efficiencies can be found. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Wanda McIntyre, who's briefly going to review the changes in the length of the school day that's occurred over the last several years. And this does have a real bearing on how efficiently we can run the buses. So Wanda, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas. I'm going to go into the school hours slide. Great, thank you. This is a little history of where we've been over the years with our hours and where we were and where we are today. If you take a look at the first column, the high schools prior to 2008, 2009, school hours were 7:17 to 1:55. As we moved into 2008 and 2009, transportation was directed to add 10 minutes to the length of the day. We didn't want to add it to the front end, so we added the 10 minutes to the dismissal. So that's when we went to 2:05. And then, of course, as everyone's aware, 17 to 18, and today we were asked to move 15 minutes. So you see that 7:30 to 2:18 is what time high schools let out. Under each of those columns, and that actually moved us from a 6-hour, 38-minute requirement for high schools to 6 hours and 48 minutes for high schools. But when we go back to 2007, 2008, and prior, Anne Arundel County operated with 6 hours and 30 minutes for the middle school. And you can see the variations in the times in which we started and we ended. And then the elementaries followed at 6 hours and 15 with a closure of 3:35. And when you look at the column of 2008 to 2017, you see that we added the 10 minutes, ending the middle schools at approximately around 3:50 with a 6-hour, 40-minute day. The elementaries went to 6 hours and 25 minutes and ending around 3:55. Of course, through the years, the growth in the county required some times and change hours. Every year, a specialist would take a look at the hours in which a school operated, whether we needed to add 5 minutes, whether we could reduce by 5 minutes, and we would take that into consideration. Sometimes we needed to add by 5 minutes because of travel, timing, equipment, and that did occur through those years. So as we moved into 17 and 18, and then today, adding the 15 minutes has changed the hours, of course, for the middle school to a 4:05 dismissal. And then, of course, our elementary, as everyone's aware, the 4:10 is our latest elementary school. So that has taken us from prior years of 2007 up until today. If we go into the next slide, as Mr. Douglas talked about tiering and scheduling and routing, I'm going to take you through a bus ride of bus 438. 438 services the Meade area. Bus 438, all bus drivers are required to do a pre-trip in the morning. Their pre-trip, this bus pre-trips at 6:10 in the morning, departs the yard at 6:25. I'm not going to go through all the bus stop times. However, it does depart from the yard and it travels to Laurel. It covers the bus stops listed for the high school. By the time it leaves Laurel, it must come back to the high school for delivery. It does arrive at the school around 7:08 to 7:10 in the morning. By the time it sits in the lineup of probably about 25 buses, it unloads. It has a small layover in the morning. Then it leaves Meade High School and it goes across the road in the Severn area, starting its pickup around 7:40, runs through the bus stops, all those bus stops listed there in front of you, and arrives at Meade Middle School around 8:14. Again, it must wait till it can unload. Students depart the bus, it pulls out, it has a small layover, small, very small. It then shoots across the road at 175 over into the Seven Oaks community. It starts picking up around 8:25. If you notice that there's an SSS beside the bus stop, SSS stands for same side service. Due to configurations of roadways, we must provide same side service for safety. So in doing so, the bus may have to travel, as we call it in transportation, around the barn in order to service those students safely. So the bus starts at 8:25, picks everybody up, and it arrives at MacArthur around 8:50 for a 9 o'clock start. It then has to get off of the base, out through the gates, and it goes across the street and it starts picking up 2 bus stops, which services Meade Heights. It arrives at Meade Heights around 9:25 for a 9:40 start. We do try to accommodate in the morning the elementary principals with a request of a ETA of 15 minutes prior to school start. Could be 20 minutes, could be 25 minutes. Many of our students at elementary need to arrive at school in time to eat breakfast. It takes longer to get the children off the bus. So we do try to get them there 15, 20, 25 minutes before school starts. As we go into the next slide, I'm going to take you home from Meade High School. Meade High School, we have to be at the school 10 minutes before dismissal. As everybody just saw on the previous slide, school lets out at 2:18. We require all bus drivers to be at the school 10 minutes before dismissal. That is called lineup time. That is put in place by transportation, has been in place by transportation for years for safety. And it's primarily safety. You have high school students coming out, 2,000 students coming out and buses not in place. That's a big concern and that's a big danger zone. So bus drivers are all required to be there 10 minutes before, in their slots, motors off, and ready for students to come out and board the bus. So the bus arrives at 2:08. Students are let out at 2:25. I will say that high school administrators are wonderful. They get those students out and they get them on the buses. The bus then leaves Meade High School and it runs back to Laurel. It drops off those stops that you see listed. It leaves Laurel and it must make it back to Meade Middle School in time for dismissal. Meade Middle School dismisses at 3 o'clock. It's a very tight window. The bus departs at 3:07, drops off all its students, has to get from 175 in through the gates to MacArthur for a 3:40 dismissal. Picks up its students, takes them departs at 3:47. And then it runs the same bus stops back, dropping the last stop off at 4:08. When it drops off at 4:08 in Seven Oaks, it's in proximity to Meade Heights, which is why this trip works, and it works well. The bus then crosses the road to Reese and it goes right over to Meade Heights. And in doing so, it arrives there at 4:12. School does let out at 4:05, but buses are loading. And when the bus arrives, it loads and then it leaves. It takes the students back across the street, drops them off, and it returns to the bus lot at 4:58. That actually is called tiering and routing. That is 4 tiers, morning and afternoon, which makes a route for a school bus. If we go into the next slide, I'm going to walk you through the Meade cluster area. It's a little dizzy, but stick with me. Meade High School is the first tier. It's a 7:30 to 2:18 dismissal. As you look at this chart, you will see that there are, to the right, Arundel, Glen Burnie, and North County. It's not only that these buses leave Meade High School, there are some buses that go into Meade High School from outside the area for special programs. Our magnet programs, the IBs, both of those buses go into Meade, and they bring students from outside the area. Those buses are limited at what they can do. They're typically only able to do 2 trips. So when you're looking at the chart, you see that one bus is coming down to Phoenix. Not only does the Meade cluster take in just the regular ed students and transport them to all the schools in the Meade cluster, there's other students that have to go outside. That bus actually takes children from the Meade area to Phoenix. So if we look at the Meade High School and you see all the lines coming down, the buses are taking the students into Meade High, they're coming out of Meade High, and they're going in different directions. The first line is we consider the second tier. You see Manor View, Pershing Hill, Van Bachlen, Meade Middle School, Maryland City, Seven Oaks, and Severn. Those are all considered a second tier. When you see the third tier, that's a Ridgeway, West Meade, Jessup, MacArthur, Brockbridge. That's a third tier. And then you see the fourth tier. Fourth is the Harmons, the Cat North, the Mary Moss, and the Meade Heights. We also added, so that you would get a full understanding of a full day, the afternoon would be MacArthur Middle School and Meade Middle School activity is included in this chart. So this is a normal daily operation of around 52, 53 buses going in and out of the Meade area. Some of these trips are special needs. When you talk about the special needs ECI programs, they take in students from outside their attendance area. The bus has to have time to travel to and from. Therefore, there is not time to do a second trip. You only have time to do a first trip and a third trip. Sometimes it's a loss of a piece of equipment for us, but we still have to provide the service for the special needs children when they are entitled to go to programs that are outside their attendance area. A perfect route is 4 to 5 trips on it. If you take a look at bus 438, which is in red, which I just walked you through on the prior slides, you'll see that it left Meade High School, flows down to Meade Middle School, then it flows into MacArthur Middle School, finishing with Meade Heights. The routes are set in reverse with respect to if it works in the afternoon, it will typically work in the morning. Timing is everything in order to meet the PM afternoon dismissal times. And with that said, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Douglas.
Okay, the last thing that Wanda mentioned about tiering on the afternoon instead of on the morning, we're going to get to that in a little bit later in the presentation. But let's go on with this tiering process. In most of the tiering configurations you see in the Meade cluster here, the 3 or 4 schools serviced by each of the buses are in the same or adjacent cluster or in close proximity to each other. And this allows the efficient use of the buses. But along with this majority of routes, and this is saying in a little different words what Wanda mentioned earlier, that they transport number of regional programs or countywide magnets or special programs where the buses pick up the students at one end of the county and transport them to the other end of the county. These routes are by nature less efficient and are difficult or impossible to tier for 2 reasons. First of all, excuse me, they're longer trips. If you start in the Meade cluster, if you start in Maryland City and you're ending up at Annapolis High School, you'll find 2 things. It's for those parents who have kids on these buses, they're long trips. It takes longer to get from Maryland City to Annapolis than it does from Meade High School to Meade Middle School. The second is that once they do their trip, they started at one end of the county, they ended at the other end. They really don't have the option to do a morning and afternoon trip at either end, because in the morning they end up at Annapolis High School. They can't do things in the Meade cluster. In the afternoon, they start at Annapolis and they bring kids home to the Meade cluster. They can't do a school in the Annapolis cluster. So for those reasons, these trips are restricted in being able to tier efficiently. Other routes that fit this model are special education centers and all non-public routes, serving schools as much as 50 miles away. I'm sure many of you are aware of the one map that was on the Prismatic report that actually showed where we're transporting kids north of Baltimore. And that's if you look back in that report, that particular map is very telling. And once we transport kids north of Baltimore in the morning, there's really no time or distance to get back to do any other work. So those are trips that we can't tier effectively, other than to use for that one trip. Several of the county-wide programs also have different dismissal times on different days of the week, which prevents these buses from serving other schools. If a particular magnet program ends at 3 o'clock on Wednesday and 4 o'clock on Thursday and 4:15 on Friday, really that bus is taken from 3 until 4:15. There's no way that they can serve a 5-day route when the bus is being used at different times by the same school. Now, those are decisions that are made at the curricular level to enhance the students' curricular program, but we have to understand that there's an efficiency cost in transportation when those decisions are made. Now, if we can move to the next slide. This slide and the following slide really is one chart, and I think we're going to be able to slide between the two so that you can see both ends of this. This is the morning end of a tier for a fictitious bus, but we needed to do it this way so that you could see the concept. This is not a particular bus in the Meade cluster, but it is an average tiering that represents or that visualizes the problems we have. If you notice in the morning, tier 1 is high school, the blue tier. The green tier is a middle school, and the two tier 3 and tier 4 purple bars are elementary schools. And if there's one thing that you notice here, they're layovers, which is where a bus finishes one school and goes and parks in a parking lot for 20 minutes. And on the chart, it's called an unavoidable layover efficiency. You'll see when we get to the afternoon why it's unavoidable. And this goes to one of our biggest inefficiencies, and it's caused by the different levels of schools having different instructional days. The high school instructional day currently is 6 hours and 48 minutes. The middle school instructional day is 6 hours and 40 minutes. And the elementary instructional day is 6 hours and 25 minutes. And that's going to mean that when you try to mix the three levels together, you're going to have some gaps. Let's slide to the bottom of this chart right now to see the afternoon. And if you recall, Ms. McIntyre said that we tier on the afternoon, and if we do that, we know the morning is going to work. If you notice that there's not as much space in between the trips in the afternoon, and again, it's because of the different time or the different lengths of the school day for the three different levels. If you notice, after the high school trip, there's a 10-minute break, which is just about as much time as you need to get to your next school. So So they finish the high school run, they take that 10 minutes to get lined up for the middle school run. After finishing the middle school trip, they take 10 minutes to get to the first elementary. They do that trip and they get 10 minutes to the second elementary. I would venture to guess that if you go out and observe buses, you're going to see more buses laying over in the morning as opposed to the afternoon, because we really do try to make the afternoon as tight as possible. Now, if you slide back to the morning, if you slide back to the first tier, if we were to try to take the middle school and eliminate that 25-minute gap, and we try to eliminate the 30-minute gap between the middle school and the first elementary school, what would happen is that in the afternoon, if we'll slide back to the afternoon, the middle school trip would be concurrent with the high school trip, which is impossible, and the first elementary trip would be concurrent with the middle school trip. So the trips would stack on top of each other. And that's why if you're driving around in the morning and you're going, I see that bus sitting there for 15 or 20 minutes every day, that is inefficient as possible. And in one sense, you're right. But in another sense is we can't eliminate that gap. Otherwise, the afternoon trips would stack on top of each other. And for a dismissal at the middle school, they'd be waiting around for 25 minutes for their bus to come. One important point right here that we have to remember. If you look at some other school systems who have adjusted their time so that the mornings work well, one of the things that they've had to accept is the fact that in the afternoon, kids have to wait longer for the bus. When Montgomery County made some of these moves, it was with the agreement that in the second and third and fourth tier, that the transportation had 20, 25, 30 minutes to get the buses to the school. The buses weren't lined up at the end of the day. So those are some of the trade-offs that we have to work with if we're going to make something like that work. Now, I'm trying to get back to where I was. Okay. Those are really the routing issues that we were going to discuss. They're really, there's really one other issue that is concerning, and it's really our most serious concern when thinking about kind of truncating the length of the school day, or truncating when we pick kids at between 7:30 and 9:30, or if we drop off in the afternoon in a 1 hour gap as opposed to a 2 or 2.5 hour gap. Our absolute biggest concern is getting drivers. So we currently offer drivers a minimum of 6 hours a day, split into 2 shifts. So when they decide to take a job as a school bus driver, they understand that they're going to get paid 6 hours. It's not an 8 hour day; it's a 6 hour day, and it's done in 2 shifts, which ties them up from early in the morning until late in the afternoon. And yes, they can do things in between, but it's not as convenient a job as if you go in the morning and work 8 hours steady. And it's tough to keep drivers under those conditions, especially in a good economy. But if we were to narrow or truncate the workday to 5 hours or 4 hours a day with a break in the middle, we can not only forget about acquiring additional drivers, but we'd be in a situation where many of the drivers that we currently have now would seek other jobs. And one of the things that causes that is the fact that these drivers are not only looking for driving jobs in other school systems, but they're literally in competition with construction companies, Amazon, FedEx, Giant Foods, and a spectrum of other companies seeking CDL drivers. And they're willing to pay considerably more in wages than the school bus industry, and they can offer more hours, eliminate the split shift, and offer overtime. So So again, that's another one of the hurdles. It's another one of the difficulties that we would have to overcome in order to find solutions for truncating the tiering to a 1 hour as opposed to a 2 or 2.5 hour. And with that, that is my portion of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. McIntyre. Thank you, Les, for taking the time. I'll ask Mr. Culp in our athletics office to share some information with you.
Thank you, Dr. Alato. Good evening. Welcome to all of our new board members. Thank you for serving. My name is Clayton Culp. I'm the coordinator of athletics for Anne Arundel County. I'm joined tonight, Dr. Alato mentioned, by Brian Lehman, who are athletic specialist, and Brian will speak following me to paint the picture of a typical fall, winter, and spring day. But leading into that, I wanted to give you some background and information in relation to the impact of school start and end times, particularly at the high school level, on our athletic program. I have four key points to raise with you, and then again, I'll turn it over to Brian for those individual seasonal updates. The first point I want to raise is in relation to, in Anne Arundel County, we very much function in the athletic world with our high school campuses. It's a shared space. I think everyone on the call probably knows that. We work with Recreation and Parks. Mr. Anthony is here, but he's going to be speaking as well. Unlike a lot of neighboring counties, though, that does put it's a unique environment where we are from about 2:18 p.m., I believe, 2:30 p.m. until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Hundreds and hundreds of athletes and community members bustling around our campuses in a normal time. I think it's important to recognize that shared space concept, that the school system's property is shared, of course, with Recreation and Parks. And in the athletic world, we see and feel that every day. As you might imagine, there's a really powerful and strong need for us to collaborate with and communicate with Recreation and Parks on a regular basis. We do that. We adjust as needed, and we feel like that relationship is very positive. But certainly there are bumps along the way throughout that process always. And a couple of things I wanted to highlight in particular to the Rec and Parks relationship before I go to a different point. We do have an MOU with them, and right now the way that works is on a standard weekday, we turn over our fields and facilities to Rec and Parks at 7 p.m. And don't think about games or contests, just a day where we might be having practices. On Saturday, that turnover happens at 10 a.m. And then on Sunday, those spaces are fully for Rec and Parks to permanent use. In the event that we were to make a shift in, particularly as it relates to high school end times, there's definitely a component here if we're preserving all the athletic opportunities that exist now and extracurricular opportunities that exist now, and they come in after us, even with a shifted MOU or whatnot. An issue that certainly we do hear from our communities about currently: noise pollution, light pollution. And when our events end or when their events end, and some kind of shift further in the evening, of course, is just something to pay attention to in that regard, as well as the traffic that flows in and out of our facilities around not just practices, of course, but also games and contests, both at the Recreation and Parks level and at our level. And the last point, the last topic here related to this relationship with Recreation and Parks that I wanted to raise is that we recently actually had a chance to practice, for lack of a better term, what this would look like, a later end time for high schools. In October and November, we had a few weeks where we were able to re-engage with student athletes. I believe the returning board members remember that we had some out-of-season practices for a few weeks. But because we were doing that after the high school virtual day ended for our students and needed time for our coaches to get to campus, those in-person sessions were happening starting at 3:45, 4 o'clock for us for those few weeks earlier this fall. And that, in some regards, can be considered, again, a practice for what it might look like if we were to shift high school end times back. We only did it for 2 days a week per sport that was participating. And again, that's only about a 60 or 70 minute delay to when we would normally start practices, which would be like the 2:30, 2:45 window. But we found it to be very challenging and very quick order. It required a lot of collaboration with Rec and Parks to make those adjustments, and just found that to be an interesting window into what it might look like if high school times just shift at the end. The second point I want to raise with you regarding, again, start and end times, particularly end times, is we've adopted, as of 2 scheduling cycles ago, we adopted a philosophy in our scheduling, and to put it in very basic terms, that the goal was to get everyone home earlier. And we did accomplish that goal. We continue to work on that, but we accomplished that goal in large part by eliminating what used to be triple header athletic events on often on Tuesday nights. If you've been in the county for a while, you're just in our athletic world, you may know that we would have soccer, basketball, lacrosse games on often on Tuesday nights, and it would be a triple header. We eliminated that on weeknights. We also made some changes in regards to how we try to structure the practice times just to be as efficient as possible with the spaces that we have. And the goal there was really to get everyone home earlier. We did that going in, I'm just going to check my notes. We did that going into our scheduling cycle for the 17-18 school year. And it was done in large part, frankly, from feedback we receive on our end from our stakeholders, right? So everyone involved, the custodian that's got to work late to clean, the ticket taker that's got to work late, the athletic director, of course, their staff, the administrator that's providing supervision for that event. And we heard over quite some time a desire to try to get folks home as early as possible. We did and have worked on that these last 2 scheduling cycles over the last 4 years. And although not everyone loves it, certainly, you can't please everyone with any schedule, but we have found a couple very positive impacts. One would be, with that change, the ability now more often for an athlete to get home at a time to potentially eat dinner with their family, as opposed to being at a game that runs late into the evening on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, that kind of thing. And also the ability for that athlete to go home and address their academic needs or their family needs and things that they need to do at a more reasonable hour. Again, trying to get everyone home earlier. So we've been working on that, and we found generally support for that change. The third topic I'll raise in the athletic world has to do with facility differences. So while we are very lucky in Anne Arundel to have excellent facilities, and we see this compared to other counties all the time in our roles, we do have some inequities that certainly exist. I'll highlight some of those for you and speak to that. We currently have, most of our high schools now have more than one turf field, which really does, it opens up some flexibility and time management issues for athletic directors and their staff. It really helped quite a bit, but we do have 4 that do not have a second turf field. There's an inequity there. Whether or not your campus has lights on their baseball field, their softball field, their tennis courts, that really can have an impact on things. Most of our schools do not have that. Even something that a lot of folks don't consider, everybody has a main gym, but the auxiliary gym space or those secondary gyms and how they can be used, that's very different high school to high school. So there's just a built-in, baked-in inequity there. And then there are some sports-specific spaces that are unique at a few of our schools. And again, each one of these has an impact. As an example, we have 2 or 3 high schools that have now been able to put in a bocce-specific location on campus where unified bocce can practice, therefore removing their need to practice on a turf field, opening up that field for other programs. So those things just are in the list or on the list of, they're not the same at every high school. And while we always work to try to improve our facilities, certainly, and we are cognizant and appreciative of the resources in Anne Arundel, comparatively, they're wonderful. It's just important that we are aware of those inequities. As one example to highlight that, if we currently start baseball and softball games typically at 4 o'clock. If a school, and Drake being a baseball athlete can attest to that, right? So imagine your first baseball game on, March 25th or so, which is about when the first spring play date typically is. We start those games at 4 or as close to that as possible. If school start times ended later at the high school level and we had to, let's say, start that game at 5 o'clock at the end of March, we now really have an issue because we're pressed to finish that game now with daylight at most schools. our ability to do that in a scenario where we had to push those games to 5 o'clock would get very challenging very quickly. So that's just one scenario of many, baseball, softball specific. And then the final kind of broad topic I'll raise, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned, it has to do with, there are some sports specific impacts separate from that baseball concern that I like to call your attention to. And it's important, I feel, for me, anytime I have a chance to present, and anytime we have an audience that's listening, that we try very much in AACPS athletics to make sure that our student athletes know that there's no one sport more important than another, no one school, no one athlete, no one coach. And often, frankly, we do things to try to make sure we are particularly supportive of those lower profile sports. And in a world where we shift end times, those sports, in many regards, those sports would also be or could be, unfortunately, negatively impacted. I just want to mention a few of those examples, specific sports scenarios. Golf being one. Of course, golf is very much tied to daylight. And in order for us to offer that sport, we're going to have students get out there and essentially start to get a half round or a round of golf in by 3:30 at the latest. So you can imagine what that would mean for golfers if we had an impact like that. Swimming is another sport that I bring to your attention. Swimming and bowling, I'll package them together. We participate in those sports at outdoor facilities. We are fortunate to have really good relationships with our pools and our bowling alleys, but they have a large community interest, right, that comes in later in the day. And the way it works now is we're able to get in prior to that community time. Of course, very much, we, again, appreciate those relationships, but to keep all that positive, we'd have to get really creative if we had to get into our swimming pools and bowling alleys at an even later time than we are now. Indoor track is another sport I would mention. So indoor track is one where we do all of our competitions at facilities that are actually outside of this county. The facility we use most often is the Prince George's Sports and Learning Complex in PG County. They have a hard end time of 9 p.m. If you've never been to an indoor track meet, I really encourage everybody to go. They're wonderful events, but that's a 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. solid window of time. And in a world where we had to start that later, you'd be looking at either limiting the participation at the athlete level or changing the event structure, which would be a sport that doesn't get a lot of competition to begin with. That would be a pretty big shift. So with any of those, I also would just some people might be thinking about, well, the solution could be to get folks out of school early. And we do that in athletics when we need to. But I just want to raise this point as well, that if we needed to get a golfer or a swimmer or an indoor track athlete out of school earlier in a scenario where high school ends later, there's always that potential impact of that being the same class over and over again, and the academic concern around what that would look like. So it's just something to certainly pay attention to their students and student athletes, the student component being most important, of course. So hopefully that gives you a broad sense of some of the impacts in terms of particularly high school end times on our athletic program. I'm going to turn it over to Brian now, who's going to speak to you a bit more about what a fall, a winter, and a spring day may look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Clayton. I've been given the task of giving you a very brief overview of what our normal structure is. And to dovetail on what Clayton said, every school is a little bit different, every facility is a little bit different, but I'll try to give you a very brief overview of our normal fall grid, our winter grid, and our spring grid. Fall with being football, field hockey, soccer, volleyball, cross country, and unified tennis. Our basic grid for the stadium fields and the turf 2 at a few schools with the Bermuda. Generally Monday and Wednesday, we have 2 slots of practice from 3 to 5 and 5 to 7, which then the community takes over with Little League from 7 to 9, and then adult leagues from 9 until completion of those events. Our game competition has a matrix of the field hockey, volleyball, and soccer. Home and away on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 5 and 6:30. Generally, the field hockey and volleyball travel to one school, and the soccer's played at another school. And then Friday, we have a doubleheader of football, 4 and 6:30. So you can see the fall's very tight, and that doesn't even take into consideration, the cross-country program when we have meets on campus, unified tennis, and the cheerleading is generally in an auxiliary gym. And volleyball has their own space in the main gym. For the winter, the practice gets a lot tighter because generally there's only one main gym with 4 basketball teams. Depending on when they start practice, it's 3, 5, 7, and 9, or 2:30, 4:30, 6:30, and 8:30. Cheerleading and wrestling generally split the auxiliary gym with a 3 to 5, 5 to 7. Indoor track generally stays outside as much as possible. And then bowling and swimming go off site. Our game is Tuesday and Friday. Basketball, as Clayton said earlier, we've moved from 4 to 5:30 in order to get those students home during the week. On Friday, we do have the traditional triple header at 3:35 and 7 for basketball. Wrestling in that matrix, we move to Wednesday nights generally, with a 6 o'clock start with JV and varsity in order so basketball can get a practice or 2 in prior. The spring matrix is a little bit different than the fall, but it also has unique characteristics with lacrosse and track and bocce sharing generally the stadium field. Baseball and softball have their own, but it comes into the lighting now. We've pushed that back to 4:15 starts for over the last couple of years for baseball and softball. And they're right on the verge for the first 3 or 4 weeks of possibly getting their games in before light. The lacrosse schedule has to be manipulated around the track schedule as well. The track cannot practice during a boys lacrosse game or practice. So lacrosse practices on Monday, generally Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday are 3 to 5, 5 to 7, and that's our time. Then Park and Recs comes in. They have gone to the same schedule as basketball with 4 and 5:30 weekday games, and then with the traditional triple header on Fridays. So I know that was very brief. I could spend hours on that, but that just lets you know how compact our facilities are on a daily basis. Very different on a practice day versus a game day. And I'm sure Mr. Anthony and Mr. Culp have touched on points of emphasis of whether the schedule can be moved one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We will, Dr. Lotto, both be available for questions as needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Clayton and Brian. Appreciate the information. There's a lot there, and there's a lot to scheduling use of fields, and then, of course, coordinating with Mr. Anthony and his team. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Anthony. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. And congratulations to all the new board members. As Dr. Arlaudo alluded to, we have just a fantastic relationship with the Board of Ed. Quite a bit of coordination that needs to be done with all the moving parts, as you kind of already touched on. And my comments will be brief. Clayton and Brian both did an excellent job kind of laying out some of the challenges of working with our agency. But, you know, the relationship we have is a model for the entire state, and it's really been working well. Our department, unlike a lot of the other large counties, such as Prince George County, Howard County, and Montgomery County, really doesn't have the portfolio of amenities that they do, especially managed by the Rec and Parks Department. So we depend heavily on the school amenities. We have over 100 accredited groups that we schedule and permit, both gyms and fields. And as you can imagine, the demand is just continuing to grow. A matter of fact, I think this is an important point to make, is that the demand for facilities were so great back then when, under the leadership of former Speaker Mike Bush, he had a great idea to program open space funds to get synthetic turf stadiums in all of our fields so that it would expand the use of these facilities. And it has been a huge success, so much so that we've expanded that, as Clayton touched on, to some second fields and some of the systems. So without a doubt, the biggest demand that we have on for us and our amenities are athletic fields. And any sort of adjustment to that would certainly have some sort of impact on our programs, our ability to schedule both practices and games. Right off the bat, we would probably have a lot of younger athletes that would be required to practice a lot later. And quite frankly, a lot of organizations would get locked out completely because of the shortened time period that we are allowed to use the facilities. We come in right away when the high schools are done. As Clayton mentioned, most of the time 7 outdoors and 6 o'clock in the gyms. And I tell you, we use every minute of that time. Sometimes several organizations will come, or several teams and leagues will come right after each other. So I believe the MOU that was put in place was really to continue to invest and protect the investments that we also made in the schools, and make sure that all of our residents are going to get served and taken care of properly. We also have 39 childcare sites in the schools. Again, another great relationship. And although they're not at the high school, any change in time would have an impact on those childcares. Certainly a later start time would cause a more demand for childcare among a lot of our parents. And we have a very difficult time filling those morning slots for before school care. And then conversely, on the evening side, we depend heavily on a lot of high school students for part-time work in the evenings for aftercare. So that could, certainly hurt our ability to be able to staff a lot of our child care sites. So, I'm here to answer any questions as well. But like I said, I think Clayton and Brian just really did a great job. But there is a tremendous impact on any change that the school systems or the Board of Ed proposes that will definitely have a domino effect to some of the things that we struggle here within Rec and Parks. So thank you all for your time tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony. As always, we appreciate the partnership. It is a model for the state, much having to do with your leadership over the years. So, and we know how busy you are. So thank you for taking the time out to be with the board this evening.
My pleasure.
Lastly, from us, Dr. McMahon has got a couple of things to review with you, and then we're going to open it up for questions to the board. Dr. McMahon.
Thank you, Dr. Alato. Thanks for allowing me to back clean up here on the sports piece, the activities, the co-curriculars, and the childcare. So just in alignment with the sports comments from Mr. Culp, Mr. Lehman, and Mr. Anthony, the co-curriculars fall into that same zone. If things go later in the day, if school goes later in the day, so too do the co-curriculars. And the same things happen. They run into darkness, they run into family life late in the day, they run into transportation problems, and they run into safety and security as nightfall comes. So any of our co-curriculars fall into that same zone. Now, with respect to the child care, I do want to take a moment to talk about both ends of the spectrum, because in fact, child care really, we have about 40,000 students that fit into the range where childcare could be a necessity for them and really for their families, right? And we're talking about our ECI, our pre-K through 5th grade, and up into our 6th graders. So the issues that came out of the Start Times Task Force were numerous, but actually with childcare, the big ticket items are morning care, afternoon care, which you would say, certainly that's true. But also transportation, because walking and biking comes into that civil twilight time, that light time before sunrise and that light time after sunset, where we're allowed to have students walk and bike ride, but visibility is diminished during those times. So we have to watch those 2 times. And then finally, the quality of life. Parents, especially parents, but the Start Times Task Force were stakeholders from around the district, and they had constituents out that they were always speaking to. And the notion of quality of life for childcare was about after school activities, before school activities, after school activities, and the ability to spend time with children in the evening before bedtime. So it was a big deal. And finally, this notion that whether or not elementary moves is not a question. If we move start times, as Mr. Douglas said in the beginning, for high school, we move start times for elementary. So let's talk for 2 minutes about that. If we move start times for high school down, it most likely means that elementary goes earlier. Now, when elementary goes earlier, the good news is you don't need morning care in many cases because parents, guardians are there when the students get off to the bus. You might have an issue with walking in the civil twilight time, but you don't need morning care most likely. Then you go through your day, it's pretty good. And they get out early, which is pretty good. But a little something that didn't fall into many people's heads until we really delved into this was a lot of siblings, older siblings, take care of younger siblings. But if elementary goes first, then many of those older siblings are still in school. So the demand for afternoon childcare goes up. It makes sense, but you have to think about it. But if you listen to Mr. Anthony, you heard him say, ooh, we have a little problem filling our morning slots. Well, it's usually because nobody wants to pay for anything they don't need. So if you don't need morning care and you need afternoon care, the first people who get afternoon care slots are people who also need morning care slots. And so actually we have a supply-demand issue. There just simply in Anne Arundel County aren't enough daycare providers often available for the people who need care, this boutique care. They don't need care at both ends. They need boutique care at one end or the other, and they only need it for the hours they need it and on the days they need it. And that's very tricky. And I know Mr. Anthony would agree. It's the number one big thing that the daycare providers tell us. So along with all of that, our daycare providers need licenses, and licensing has gotten harder and harder over the years. And so now to get a license to have people involved in daycare, they have to have more hours of study and more certificates and the ability to get a license. And so that has just magnified the daycare issue. I think finally, I would say transportation is a key to all of this. And so let's go with daycare first. These daycare facilities have small numbers of vehicles that they can transport students. So the parents take the students to the daycare provider, and the daycare provider often takes the students to school. The only way for the daycare provider to have enough students to actually meet their payroll is that they have to service schools that all start at different times. So the 1 or 2 buses that they have can go to a school, come back, get the next group, go to a school, come back, get the next group. It's very intricate. We learned so much on the start time about the workings of daycare facilities, especially the large ones. There are 5 large ones in Anne Arundel County, and then about 70 to 90 more. And many of them, unfortunately, in these last 9 months have come upon really tough times, and many have closed their doors. Most recently, one of our largest. So with that, I say the variables, even though we're talking childcare and it sounds like we're only talking about elementary, we're not. We're talking about older siblings. We're talking about the ability for those siblings to get their younger brothers and sisters and help them out for a small period of time. We're talking about co-curricular clubs and whether or not students will take advantage of them if the day gets longer, because families really said to us, don't infringe on family time. It's the only time we can be together after the evening meal in many cases. So we have all of these. And then we have the special programs. Special programs now depending on whether or not they have extended days. Some of those buses, hour and a half trips, they're getting home on the extended days, 6:30. That will move them later. And then overall in the high school world, one of the big things that came up were jobs and internships. When we extend the day, we go into the evening hours, and those evening hours shorten the opportunity for students to have internships. So nothing negative. The daycare provider said, if you give us enough notice, several months, we can make things work. We can't guarantee, but we'll do our best. And we know we can move, we can be flexible, but there are limits to the flexibility when you speak of transportation, darkness, and the ability for families to have quality of life. That's it for me, Dr. Lotto. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. McMahon. So members of the board, thank you for listening so patiently. We wanted to again give you some background information so that everybody on the board, this new board is all operating from the same information. You've got lots before you that we sent. Luckily, you're not making a decision tonight, so this is a beginning part of the conversation for the board and with staff and the community. With that, we'll begin to start with Ms. Antwine.
Dr. Alato, before we begin, I just wanted to, if I just may, take a presidential privilege here for a second and just thank Mr. Anthony for joining us. Thank you so very much. In addition to our hardworking staff, I know you're taking your time out, and as he indicated, childcare is in the hot seat right now during COVID, and among many, many other things, our recreational sports programs that you have been supporting so well have gone such a long way to the mental, social, emotional health of our community. And I just have to take this opportunity, sir, to say thank you so very much. And I know you have a hardworking team sitting behind you, many of whom I miss working with, and a couple I know who have moved along since I have had the pleasure and honor and privilege of working with you guys. And so I know you guys are doing everything you can, and I just want to do a major shout out, and please extend that to your staff, who hopefully are not listening to us because they're spending quality time with their family this evening.
Some of them might just be making sure I don't mess anything up. So I think some of them are watching me.
I'm sure.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate those kind words. I will pass that on.
Absolutely. So Dr. Arlotto, you may resume. I just wanted to make sure I had an opportunity to thank Mr. Anthony on behalf of the board.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Antwine.
Dr. Arlotto may be experiencing an issue because I know she was logged in earlier. I'm wondering if something may have occurred with her ISP or something similar. Maybe we could go back to her after we go through, or if we notice that she has been able to log back in, but I do not observe her being here, and we will definitely reserve an opportunity for her to ask questions and make comments if she's available.
Yes, ma'am. I'll move on then. Thank you. Mr. Silkworth, any questions or comments?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Alata. I do understand the Association of Pediatricians who suggest an 8:30 a.m. start time. However, I've read all of the reports, and the 2016 report was overwhelmingly rejected by all of the stakeholders. And I have some anecdotal experience myself, and my experience is a bit different. It would suggest that based on recent conversations and interviews with students, that maybe 75% of our students do not want to change at all. However, just because that's what they might say, that's not necessarily what our decision should be. So I took a look at some of the recommendations. One of them was a high school recommendation of 8:15 start time, with elementary, I believe, was 7:50, and middle school's at 9 o'clock. And I had a question about that in terms of safety issues for elementary school students starting earlier because they're not used to doing that. One of the things that I read in the report said that the buses would be jam-packed with 3 students per seat in the bus. And I had some concerns about that. And I also had some concerns about a few other things, the cost for actually doing that. And my final question would be to Mr. Culp. And that would be if we were to go to one of the later start times, which was 9:30, would it not happen that many of our students would actually be practicing and doing their football and basketball at 7 or 7:30, which would kind of negate what the Association of Pediatrics really wants to do in terms of getting our students more sleep. I do believe that this is an issue we clearly have to come to grips with for the benefit of our kids, but just those few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Silkworth. So I will, I think it's, let me just start and then I'll pass it on to Mr. Douglas and then Clayton to round out your questions regarding athletics. I think it goes without saying, but I'll just state for the public that's listening and the board that in a tiered system. So as you heard about from from members of our transportation department, the concept of the tiered system is to get the most out of a single bus. A single bus is most efficient when it can do a number of runs in a day. And so in a tiered system, somebody's got to start first. You have to have a set of schools that begin first. You've got to have somebody in the middle. And in the three-tier system, you've got to have somebody that is the last pickup and drop-offs of the day, right? That's obvious. And so your point about elementary schools, I know that was a really big part of the conversation with the task force at the time about as we are developing possibilities and options for the board at the time to consider and into the future. And knowing that a tiered system has to have somebody starting first, there are some concerns about elementary school students, and this is to your point, beginning first. That's something that we'll have to talk about, look at very carefully, and ultimately it will be the board's decision. But the concern was not having our youngest students out at the bus stops earliest. And that was part of the conversation among the task force and the work they did at the time. Anything to add, Mr. Douglas?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I quite understood the question, but if I can just address the issue. I think if this move is going to be made, it means we have to do one of two things. We have to either rearrange within the same time that we have now, or we have to truncate the tiering. So that instead of doing 3 trips, you only do 2. And there are quite a few systems in the country who just do 2. Of course, geographically, they don't have some of the problems that Anne Arundel County has. I mean, we've gone into the fact that we have a lot of magnet programs where they pick up on one side of the county and bring to the other side. 2 things I didn't mention are that we do have 2 very large military bases that are hard to get on and off of, which takes time. The other thing is, and don't underestimate this, the whole eastern half of the county is a series of peninsulas that there's one way in and one way out. That also takes time. So these are geographic issues that make it a little more difficult in Anne Arundel County as opposed to Keokuk, Iowa, where they still have quarters and the buses can get around much easier. I'm not sure that answers the question, but.
Well, for the sake of clarification, the issue about the elementary will be safety, because as it currently is, we have our high school kids out and about very early in the morning when it may be dark. If we were to move such that the elementary students would be first, we would then have elementary students that would be out and about when it could potentially be dark. Now, the one final comment, and that is that late start times or a different start time is not new to Anne Arundel County, because I can tell you that back in both when I went to school in Anne Arundel County, but back when I started teaching, we had a start time of 8 o'clock. And our students were, they did leave the buildings at 2:50. I can also tell you that when I taught at Southern Junior High School down the county, the same thing was true. We had a start time of 8 o'clock. So a later start time is not new. It's something that we have had in the past, and it's an issue we need to deal with and try to get it decided.
Right. But a very good point, because I too remember going to high school at 8 o'clock or 10 minutes of 8. But the difference is that the state has the high school day is longer than it used to be.
Absolutely.
So that's one reason why we bring them in earlier, is because it is a longer day.
Thank you. Mr. Cole?
Yes, hi, Mr. Silkworth. Just in response to you, I believe you kind of gave a scenario there of before school practices in a world where high school started significantly later. What I would say to that is we would never want to sacrifice any of our programming, right, that we currently offer, nor I'm sure would Mr. Anthony want to sacrifice anything on his end to the extent that we could avoid that. So we need to be creative. If high school started significantly later, in order to preserve all of those opportunities, those extracurricular opportunities, we would need to be creative. There's no doubt about it. And I will just say this much, practices are different than contests, right? So can you have a soccer practice at 7 in the morning? Or are you going to have a soccer game at 7 in the morning? Because you're going to have both of those things exist in the season. I don't have a hard and fast answer for you other than to say we would definitely have to get creative if there was a significant push back to that high school schedule.
Thank you.
And Mr. Silkworth, I would agree. Your comment was it sort of defeats the purpose. If the purpose is to gain time in the day for sleep for our adolescents, then starting practices early in the morning doesn't really make a lot of sense. And that's not something that I would support.
Precisely.
I think the whole idea is if we're going to shift start times, we're going to shift to start times in favor of the students getting more rest.
Exactly.
Thank you, sir.
Candace is on and wants to be recognized.
Thank you, Mrs.
Thank you,
Schallheim.
Ms. Schallheim. We're working through that tech issue right now. We have been for several minutes now. We'll jump her in as soon as we can. You may proceed, Mr. Arlano.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Mr. Silkworth. Ms. Frank.
So can you hear me or you can't hear me? Is that what are you saying?
I can hear you, Candace.
Great to hear you.
Okay.
Thank you for your
If the president
patience.
is willing
Yeah.
for me to take the floor, I'd like to take it at this time, please.
Yes, ma'am, you may.
Thank you. I want to, any technical difficulties, I want to apologize for, but remind everyone on the phone, especially our team that's working hard and late tonight, that I have been dialing in via phone as well as Zoom so that we can avoid such difficulties. So if you see me muted or otherwise, please remind me to simply unmute. In this case, I was unmuted, but so that we can move forward, I would appreciate that. My two questions this time concerned the COVID state. While I appreciate sincerely the pre-COVID as is state, I did not hear from anyone tonight any considerations for the new COVID rules, as well as the effects of COVID on our present day. It is my anticipation that even as we move forward, we will move forward after February in a hybrid state, which changes many of the dynamics mentioned tonight. So my question would be, have we considered the effects of COVID as we plan for our bus routes, our child care that was mentioned, our athletic fields, uses, and otherwise? First question. Second question, has there been an RFI to the contractors requesting information on how to introduce more efficiencies if time should change from 8 to about 4 o'clock. Thank you.
So, Mrs. Antoine, I'll begin, Les, and then I'll turn it over to Les on the second part. Regarding your first question, if I'm understanding correctly, you're asking about, or there's been no discussion up to this point about the current circumstance we're in because of COVID, and the possibility of us moving, and we are currently planning on moving into a hybrid model come the second semester, of course, if the metrics such allow. So we have taken a great deal of consideration in terms of transportation. When we do go into a hybrid model, we will have reduced number on buses. We'll have certain protocols for entry and exit onto the bus, as well as entry and exits to and from the schools. So we don't have students crowding through the same entryway, as you will. So we've gone through each of our school buildings, and in that process of deciding where walkers, riders, drop-offs, bus riders will come and go from buildings. So those considerations regarding health and safety in this current COVID environment have been taken into account, and we are doing that planning now should we enter into the hybrid model in February. Mr. Douglas?
Okay, as I understand the question, it's are we going to what degree are we going to involve the contractors in finding efficiencies? And I want to take this opportunity to thank the board for your response to some of the prismatic recommendations, and especially the one that provided the routers that I believe, and Wanda, you would have to answer this, but were actually requested when the routing program was first talked about back in 13, 14, and 15. But my answer to your question is, we're not going to leave that up to the contractors. We feel like we have been restructuring our shop in such a way that there are three basic areas that you are going to see some difference in efficiencies in the routing. The first one, if you recall early on in my presentation, I said, when you take stops into trips, you want to make sure that you combine them in such a way that you maximize the number of kids that are on a bus. Excuse me, optimize the number of kids, so that we're putting more kids on each bus. The additional staff that we've been given allows us to put a lot more brain power and a lot more effort into that. And you almost need to know the backstory here. The folks that have been routing, like Wanda, are the folks that are also responsible for monitoring bus drivers, for monitoring buses, for doing all the work out on the road, for monitoring the schools. Now, they can either be out on the road doing that job, which is where they really belong, or they could be sitting in front of a computer not doing that job. The way you have allowed us to restructure this office with routers is that we have people dedicated to doing nothing but the routing. And we make about 3,000 routing changes from September to June. And that takes an awful lot of effort. We now have the ability to do that and to develop the metrics so that we can load the buses in a much more effective way and efficient way. The second thing is in the tiering, in that now the way we're staffed, we're going to be able to give a lot more effort into tiering efficiently. So in those two areas, I think over the next period of time, you're going to see some efficiencies occurring. But to answer your question, we don't want to relegate that to or give that to the contractors. We want to be able to stipulate to contractors, this is the way you're running the route, and this is the way we expect for you to run it, based on the efficiencies that we find and that we dictate that they should be using.
Thank you for that. I want to share some clarity on my question. I wasn't first and foremost doubting that you all are doing everything that you can with the expertise that you have and the experience that you have to ensure the best in terms of routing and this entire transportation system. What I was requesting was a request for information on ideas from the contractors, which should be part of their job once they're hired by us to introduce how they would get their job done. So I was asking about requests for information back to them that may introduce some ideas and some efficiencies to see if that has been done or not. What I'm hearing from you is that that has not happened, right?
Well, no, we have a constant communication with the contractors, and we don't. It's not a dictatorial relationship where we say you must do it this way. All I'm saying is that we now have not so much the expertise. The expertise has always been in this office, even way before I got here. It's the time to do it all thoroughly. Is that it's difficult to spend the time on the routing that you need to when you're still going out and looking at the safety functions out on the road. And the way we're structured now is that we can take that expertise that has been in this office and use it in a much more productive way. I can assure you that there is a two-way communication with contractors. As much as we want it done the way we stipulate, we also understand that the bus drivers are the ones who see that on a daily basis. So no, we very much respect data and information we get from bus drivers and contractors. We don't ignore that information. And if I sounded like that's what I was saying, I apologize.
I didn't pick that up at all. I just
Okay.
wanted to understand what ideas and recommendations they were introducing to us to create some of these efficiencies. The samples that you all shared tonight, and I appreciate it greatly, was the Meade area. Well, as
Right.
you know, we've opened up more roads, thankfully, because of the BRAC moves. We've opened up more routes. The base has, in the morning, for example, instead of the one gate, it now has 3 gates open. Just different changes have occurred that could influence those changes. So thank you very much for you and Dr. Arlotto for answering my question.
Sure.
Thank you, Ms. Antwine. Ms. Frank.
Hi. Back in my day, we had a 7:17 start time. You guys are lucky. So I just had a couple of questions about the law regarding the start times. I believe it was 6 hours and 38 minutes. At some point, if somebody could just pull that aside and give me a little bit of a history as to why the school day was extended. Was it arbitrary? Was it reactive? Maybe not this moment, because I know that might be a little involved, but at some point to understand why the school day was extended and what the law specifically states as far as school day and time of day. My question is for Mr. Douglas. So you talked about Southern High School having 88 square miles in that district. What is the average capacity for a school bus in Southern? You sort of touched on it, but didn't quite give me a number. Do you have a Southern High School bus capacity average?
I can't give you the average for that one school, although I can follow through with it and get it to you through the superintendent within a matter of days. So you want to know the average load that we currently have, or do you want to know the target that we're aiming at?
The average load that you currently have, I guess, and the target would be helpful as well. And I guess my train of thought here is page 388 of the Prismatic. Scenario 1 suggests, and this is the scenario that if I were to go with any would be the more preferable, obviously, suggests that the average number of students on a bus would be a target of 50. Yeah, would be 50. So if we're having around 50, 55 students on a bus now, what are the lower averages that are going to mean that we have to bring our higher averages up later? So I would want to kind of get an idea of, if we went with one of these plans, how many students would have to be on a bus to be able to follow their suggestions? And would we be having to seat 3 students on a bus in some areas to compensate for areas of lower capacity? So I guess I would want to kind of feel that out with you.
Okay. First of all, let me give you just some other information here, because 50 is a bit high in some instances, and it's a bit low in other instances. We have primarily, and there's some other capacities, but we primarily have 11 row buses, which will seat 44 students at 2 to a seat, and we have 13 row buses, which will seat 50. I lose the number, but if you think 2 students per bench, which is customary for high school. You don't want high school or middle school students sitting more than 2 to a seat. And 50 would be a bit high for that, especially at the high school level. Now, I know earlier in the conversation tonight, someone mentioned having 3 elementary school students on a seat. But if you get on an elementary school bus, depending on the size of the students, it's rated for 3 students, and at the elementary school level, 3 kindergartners, 3 first graders, 3 second graders fit very comfortably on a seat. So we don't consider that to be an overload. At the high school level, we would rather not have 3 students in a seat, because one of them is halfway in the aisle. So that really changes with the size of the bus. Which is one reason why, now that we have the routers and we have the manpower to collect this information on a more regular basis and to make those adjustments, we're going to be able to adjust those loads much more responsively than we have in the past. Because the 2 things on fixing an overload with too many kids on a bus, one is it has to be identified, that it's an overload. Second is, you have to identify a place to put them. You have to identify empty seats on other buses, and that's the more difficult of the 2 problems, is identifying where the empty seats are. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is, as we get this routing department with the routers in and in their seats, and the first one came in today, the second one's going to be on board next Monday, and the third one is still unidentified yet. So we're in the process of hiring them now. But one of the things they're going to be doing is collecting a lot more data than we collect now, and we can use those metrics to hone some of these numbers. Because right now, we're catching up with problems. We're not identifying that we need this many. I would say that at the Prismatic report, that's, and I think your point was, if we're using an average and there's some buses that have less than the average, we're going to have some that are overcrowded. Yeah. And those are the kinds of issues that we really want to attack, and we will be attacking much more effectively now that our department is restructured in the way it is. I'm not sure I quite answered your question, but
yeah. To be clear, I just want to make sure that if we're sticking to some of the models that we've been presented, we're not overloading our students and having 3 to a seat in cases where we can avoid.
Well, let me
be sure, because I know that
sure.
Even as tiny as my kids are, 3 in a seat, they get just elbowy.
Well, and again, I don't mean that every single elementary school student should be sitting 3 to a seat. But as I get on buses, if you see 3 kindergartners, they fit well into the seat. If 3 fifth graders, no. So it's different. Can I mention one other thing? Because this is something that we've been working on some documentation within the office. We don't want to optimize every trip. What we want to do is optimize the route. So if we can schedule that we have 4 bus loads, 4 trips in a route that have 35 kids, what's the math on that? 4 times 35 is going to be 140 kids. I might be wrong there, but 4 times 35 is 120 plus 20 kids, 140 kids. Okay, or can you fit 3 bus loads of 40, which is 120? Well, the 4 trips of a lower load is really optimizing the use of that bus over 4 trips. Does that make sense? If we can have fewer kids on the bus for 4 trips as opposed to more kids on the bus for 3 trips, and we service more kids with the 4 trips and more empty seats, we see that as a victory. We're servicing more kids on that bus on a daily basis. So those are the kinds of analysis that we're going to be working on.
Okay, good. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And then I think I have one more question.
Okay.
Okay. I have a question for Mr. Anthony. Is he still available? Is he still here?
Yes, I'm still here.
Hi, Mr. Anthony. Thank you for
Hi.
your help tonight. You mentioned that there are 39 childcare sites and that you use high school students to staff a lot of those aftercare needs. Do you have any sort of estimate on about how many high school students we depend on as of right now?
That's a great question. I actually asked my chief that question this evening, and she said anywhere about 10 to 15%. It does fluctuate, obviously, from school semester to semester. And another good point is that a lot of these students are interested in going into either child care or some sort of teaching position. So this gives them great experience for their future endeavors.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Frank. Ms. Ellis.
Thank you so much. I, of course, have a number of questions, and I know we're going to go in rounds, so I obviously will have to pick and choose at the moment. I'm sorry, I'm deciding where to begin. I think I'm going to begin
You're muted.
I went on for that long without knowing I was muted. I apologize. Thank you for telling me that. Okay. First, I want to thank everyone who is here as a panelist to work with the board. And I know it sounds like there's an awful lot of reasons that, you know, maybe this might not be the highest priority for some, but I see this as an opportunity to identify what the challenges are at this point in time, so we can begin to work through and find solutions. As the overview that Dr. Arlotto gave us in the beginning shows, this is an issue that's not going away. The county's been dealing with this for several years now and is well invested in this, and it's because it's for the health and well-being of our students. I have, of course, many questions, but I know we're going in rounds, so I'm just going to have to pick right now. So I will start. If you don't mind, Mr. Culp, I have a couple of questions. Thank you. So you were talking about, was listening to you talking about the baseball season, and you gave some sort of typical scenarios. You gave 4 o'clock as a typical game starting time. Currently, high school releases at 2:18. So is that 4 o'clock time the earliest a game can typically start? And can you explain that?
I'd be happy to, Ms. Ellis. We do at the beginning of that spring season try to go as early as we can. However, there's a number of, because of the daylight issue, end of March, early April. But I'm thinking here you're trying to get at what happens right between school getting out and the game starting, and maybe why that takes so long. So the one component, of course, is the visiting team getting to the site of the game and what it takes for them to get out of class, get to their locker room, change, get on a bus that's usually coming to that facility after the other buses have left, and then get to the school that they're going to play. So that transportation component, of course, is critical in the athletic world. That part is the transportation. And then in baseball, softball in particular, there is a pretty extensive field setup process that happens. Drake could attest to this, to get every game, to get every field ready. Typically, the athletes are heavily involved in that as well at the home school, but there's prepping the field, and then there's a standard warm-up procedure and time allotment for each school as well. So all of that has to happen prior, or should happen prior to the start of.
And how long is a game typically? That's just a quick follow-up, I hope.
Yeah, that can vary wild. I mean, they can be quick. You can have a game end in a little bit over an hour but that's unusual. They can also go on. It's really hard with baseball, softball to give you a time for that because each inning can be different, and the competitive level of the game can change that quite a bit.
Oh, and
Okay, as a follow-up, I'd love to give some sort of average on that, but that can be another time.
I think I can maybe respond. I would say about an hour and 40 at like the latest, but like normally around like 2 hours, I think, just from my experience.
Okay, I'm asking because
that's right. I think from JV and varsity about 2 hours. I think that.
I would agree with Drake. 2.5 hours is probably a typical number if that's what you're looking for.
Okay, I was asking because the sunset on the scenario day that you gave, I think it was March 21st of this year, was 7/18. Okay, and then Mr. Colt, I loved that you mentioned that we need to get creative, because of course we do. We do need to get creative because the whole purpose here is the health and safety of our students. And I'm wondering if you are you aware of the research on circadian rhythm and sleep habits of teens and extra sleep needs of athletes in particular? And have you seen reports of professional teams making sleep a priority for their athletes? And along with consulting with others, have you communicated with other athletic directors at other schools or school districts? Like I know Eleanor Roosevelt has sports, and they start at 9 something, I believe. So yeah, if you could just share a little bit about that.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'm not being a health, official myself, but the conversation you're referencing, absolutely, we have that at the state level. I think in my role as the coordinator, I'm sure athletic directors across the state also at their level have this conversation with varying start times with different school systems. And I certainly wouldn't dispute anything in relation to the health factor for all of us, students, student athletes, everyone in general, in regards to sleep and the benefits of that. The logistical components in Anne Arundel, again, that have been referenced around this shared space concept that we have, makes us different in large regard from some of the other counties in terms of our relationship with our recreation and parks and what that would mean.
All right, thank you. I know I'm not going to push it with my turn, but I will have more questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. I just want to make a quick note that Mr. Anthony is got to leave. He's going to move on with his evening. Rick, thank you again for all your time, your partnership, and giving so generously of this evening. So thank you and be safe.
No, no problem. I enjoy being here. If anyone has any other follow-up questions, please send me an email.
I
I'll
will.
enjoy your
Thank
evening.
you, Rick.
All right, bye-bye.
Have a great evening.
Next is Ms. Scholheim.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in this workshop tonight and all the panelists. I appreciate your time. I'm a little surprised that what I thought was a brief presentation turned into about 90 minutes. And so definitely, I believe is going to cut into this board's ability to discuss things, especially the current state as they are now, and how we can creatively move forward instead of rehashing the past. I'm really quite troubled by what I'm hearing is all the reasons why we can't instead of all the reasons why we should and we must. We all know as adults that when we're sleep deprived, all of life's challenges are more difficult. I think we can all recognize that. We're all parents. We all remember when we had little children and we had sleep was a something we longed for and seldom got, and we should all remember what it feels like to be sleep deprived. So that is our teenagers every day for as long as this is going to go on for, which I hope is not much longer. We as a county have been through this over and over and over and over again for a decade. And really it needs to stop and we need to move forward. We have put forth, Dr. Alato has put forth plans in the past that align our high schools start times with what is recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Those are doctors, physicians, right? And they came up with that based on science and facts. And so if we were willing and able to put an 8:30 start time to high schools previously, I'm just struck by the 90 minutes of why we shouldn't. And also, you know, it was 105 minutes into this evening before we even heard the word prismatic. And this is a huge portion of our history of this subject, right? So this board put out an RFP with taxpayer money and got a consultant to look at everything and then to deliver us a report, which was discussed mere seconds before the shutdown in March. And what this shows is a fair number of problems within our transportation department. And so I guess my first question is, since the shutdown in March, since their buses have stopped running in March to now, where very few of our buses are running, what has the transportation department been up to in terms of implementing the 27, my camera's not going to show this, recommendations in this report? It says things in this report like bus routes and stops have been unchanged for many years, that we have no idea who's assigned to each bus stop, that we have no idea who rides our buses. We don't have an opt-in for bus service. And so I'm just wondering about that, if that would be my first question, and that's directed at Mr. Douglas, please.
Most of what we've been doing since March has been trying to devise plans for getting kids back into class with some of the constraints that are on us for COVID. So that's one of the things we've been doing. And we have been addressing the recommendations by the Prismatic report. I think that if I'm not mistaken, we've been submitting progress reports on each of the areas that we are responsible for in the department here. So those have been documented over that period of time.
Okay. I also want to jump back before I get into my second question. Is I want to remind everyone, and this is documented in this Prismatic report, is that we can talk all day about why we shouldn't or couldn't or how we're unique in some way that no one else in the country is who's done this. But I need to remind everyone on this panel, in the board and listening out in the audience, that this is ultimately a leadership decision, not a transportation department decision. And I know with the expertise on Dr. Arlotto's staff, including Dr. Arlotto himself, I know we can come up with, that you all can solve these problems, these challenges that shifting 60 minutes would produce, because ultimately I think we're going to see the benefit for all of our students. I heard a lot of talking about Civil Dawn and Twilight and this and that. We have that now. We have little kids getting off buses and walking in the dark after Civil Dusk and Twilight, or whatever the terminology is now. And we have high school students getting on buses, some of them at 4:30 in the morning, in the dark. And so the rationale not only is to support healthy, safe sleep patterns, is that these are all healthy, safe, age-appropriate start times for everybody. So this whole time has been just spent thinking about COVID, which is, granted, I get it, it's big. Can you please be more specific as to which just for our general public who might not know what maybe the board receives in terms of progress and recommendations, which ones you've addressed, and including about the staffing? It seemed to me in Alex's last transportation update that we had identified the 3 routers and that they were onboarding right now. You told us in your comments that we haven't identified a third. So if you can talk about both of those, one should be a very quick question, and then the specifics around the procedures, the SOPs, if you can please speak to that.
I think the third router is a personnel issue that I hesitate to give any more information about. We've interviewed, we've identified folks for those 3 positions. I really I can't go any further, because in fact that would be talking about a personnel issue, as I understand it.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So let's get to the report. So for the benefit of the general public, because we want full transparency, of course, can you address any of the specifics other than thinking about COVID and the numbers of kids on buses as it relates to COVID constraints that have been tackled and are solved and are in progress since March, and it's now December, so the last 9 months?
I can talk about issues that are being addressed and worked on. Many of those, the solution is there are many steps to the solutions, and we're working towards solutions. One of the things is that we've been producing standard operating procedures for various jobs which have not been documented. And writing standard operating procedures for something that's working well is just a matter of a scribe sitting down and documenting what's being done. Writing standard operating procedures for procedures that are not going well is devising efficient procedures first as you document them. So we have come a long way in one, documenting procedures on SOPs that are working, and devising procedures that are not working and writing SOPs for those. So that's a good bit of what we've been doing,
Okay.
other than preparing for the COVID, which is a bigger job than people would believe. So that's what we've been working on over that period of time.
Okay, thank you. I have a bunch more questions, including why we're choosing to go back to status quo when we go back. I will keep those for next time. I've been through my 2. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Schalheim. I do want to say, in reference to your opening remarks at your time to question, that I am sorry that you feel as though my staff and I have wasted your time and the time of the boards in, as you say, the 90 minutes that we put forward. We certainly didn't plan for 90 minutes. or even an hour. But we felt it important when we sat down to prepare for this evening that we gave enough background information for this entire board to move forward. Secondly, let me say that not once in our planning or once in the presentation that you heard so far this evening have I or staff said can't. I was asked to bring information that may be roadblocks, or I think Ms. Ellis used the term the big rocks in the way in terms of transportation, athletics, and childcare. And so that's what we brought forward. They're not reasons not to. They are important considerations that the board should undertake as they move forward to make decisions. So it was we never said can't. We presented as this is important information for the board and the public to understand as we move forward, and as has been said, in looking for creative solutions.
I never said wasting time. I was just pointing out that I thought we were going to have a lot more discussion, and we've cut into that. Thank you so much.
We've got lots of time for discussion through the future. This was to present information, was my understanding. So thank you. Dr. Tobin.
Dr. Arlotto, before you presume, I just want to remind the board members that in a workshop environment, if information needs to be shared and there's an impression, I mean, we have been in Q&A, you're the fifth member for quite some time, and I don't think anyone is presuming to rush anything. So just let me assure the public and the rest of the board members that clearly there is plenty of time to spend with staff tonight to provide follow-up. We've got an excellent procedure for that. And we're going to be hearing from the public on some of the things that they heard tonight, which I believe. But lastly, I just want everyone to understand that this is a culmination of more than just a member or one or two members' questions and interests. This is for the interests of the whole board. And many of our new members and in past and current have asked for this information. So I would just ask our members to please be patient and exhibit the grace and compassion that our school system likes to have in these matters. And we have plenty of time. We are not on a time crunch, and the staff is happy to continue. And we're happy to get questions to Mr. Anthony should you need them. Dr. Arlotto, you may proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. Dr. Tobin.
Thank you, Dr. Arlotto, and thank you all for the presentation. It's been valuable to hear everything, and I truly appreciate everybody coming together and making this effort on behalf of what is, I think, one of our highest responsibilities, which is the health of our students and the well-being of our students. So thank you. First couple of questions, and this may go to Mr. Douglas and possibly Ms. McIntyre. And it's nice to meet you, by the way. So I want to understand what we saw in the beginning, the presentation, particularly that Ms. McIntyre gave of what a bus goes through and so forth. Did that presume or include the changes and efficiencies in the prismatic report or not? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, one of the things that's discussed a lot in the prismatic report is contractor oversight and making sure that, they say at least on a weekly basis, what the loads are on each bus and having that checking mechanism built into it. So I'd just like to understand if what we saw was based on how we've done it before or on what has been proposed in the prismatic recommendations.
Thank you for the question.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead, Wanda.
Would you like me to respond?
Yes, please.
Thank you for the question. The route that I went over was put in place last year or the year before. And what I mean by that is some stops were added to a couple of the schools. So as communities change, loads change, the area specialists take the opportunity to make adjustments to to bus trips.
Right.
So you might have to take off a stop that might have 10 children to reduce the load from maybe 55 down to 45. So this route was put together about 2 years ago, and it runs, in my opinion, pretty efficient. And what I say by that is the number of students that are on each bus. The information for the number of students, and I'd like to just provide that to you. The high school actually has 48 students that ride. That's pretty good. That's 2 twisty. The middle school has 32 students that are on the bus. MacArthur Middle actually has 55 students. Now that's a high number, and there may be 3 to a seat, but it wouldn't be every seat. But it's still good use of equipment. And the elementary trip actually has 31 students on board. So this trip is really good use of a piece of equipment. You're getting four bus routes, four routes out of it. That's good use. When you have 3 high school, middle school, elementary, or high school, elementary, middle, because there's a couple elementaries we can wedge in between, you may be able to get an activity trip out of that. And if you can't get an activity trip out of it, then you only have 3 trips. So this work was actually put together about 2 years ago. So it would have run the same the first year and second year. And if we were operating this year, it would still be, in operation. Was it at the recommendation of Prismatic? I can't actually answer that question. The reason why I can't answer that is because specialists every year take the opportunity to reevaluate their bus trips. We have student stop counts that in the beginning, this is partnering with contractors. And this is part of their requirement as a contractor, that the bus drivers have to give us their stop counts. Now there's this, we call this actuals. This is actually what's happening out there. The bus driver will take their stop count and they will give us numbers of students boarding at each bus stop. We get that information in September, October. That's when we find out when we have some really high numbers on particular buses. And then we also ask for that number in the spring. We actually missed that opportunity last year because we were shut down on March the 11th. So we missed the opportunity to get the actuals, what was really happening out on the school bus. Bus drivers also are required to complete, which is called a time and mileage report. When they complete their time and mileage report, which is 3 times a year, we're able to look at those numbers. And if we're a question of what's happening, we can compare it with their stop count and their time and mileage. And we also have operation technicians, which is part of our staffing, who actually ride the school buses and do the counts and do a visual, as well as specialists do the same. So you can go out, get on the bus and see exactly what's happening, count the number of students, see what the capacity looks like, see how much room is actually left on a bus, where we maybe can move and be a little bit more efficient. They also look at timing, whether the bus arrives on time, whether there's a late bus coming in. So that's exactly how transportation works as whole, partnering with the contractor, the bus driver, operation technicians, and specialists.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But just to follow up, my understanding when I looked at the Prismatic report was that there was concern that those actuals were provided from the contractor to you, but not that there wasn't a lot of oversight the other way around, right? And it wasn't as regular. And I think in recommendation 18, they specifically are suggesting that you need a more regular way for tracking that and making sure that the contractors are doing what they say they're doing. And so my question was, that being one example of a number of things that Prismatic proposed that would allow for greater efficiencies and oversight and a kind of nimbleness that we need to have. If that change is included in the pictures that we saw earlier of what those routes were and so forth, or if the route that we were seeing was really, as you said, something that was put together a couple of years ago, but the processes hadn't significantly changed since the Prismatic report came out. Were you actually?
Dr. Tobin, this is Alex. Let me answer that question directly. So as Ms. McIntyre said, this route was established about 2 years ago. We received the Prismatic report just, literally right before the shutdown. So yeah, there's no way that the recommendations of the Prismatic report that we received just before the COVID shutdown could have even been contemplated for this route that was established 2 years ago. But that's the work that transportation's doing. And Mr. Douglas, in the material that was provided to the board through Ms. Howell, does have a response to your specific question in terms of the transportation department increasing the frequency of ridership counts and then independent audits for those routes. So that is one of the written responses to the 27 questions that should be in your board material that Ms. Howell provided to you.
Yeah, and that's why, thank you. That's why I was asking the question, because I wanted to understand, and also for the public to understand, that what we were seeing was not based on having those efficiencies built into the system. So with regard to thinking about the big rocks in our way, there are changes to be made and efficiencies to be gained, if I'm following what I'm hearing, that have not yet had a chance to be fully implemented.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, absolutely.
Okay, so that was my first question. My second has to do with moving from 3 tiers to 2, which was mentioned briefly in a couple of comments. And I want to make sure I understand what might or might not be difficult in that process, if I'm hearing what you said. There was discussion, as I think you said, Mr. Douglas, of some geographic specifics and so forth. But I also understood that, if I followed you correctly, that one of the big obstacles you saw, or issues that you saw that we might have to deal with, is literally getting drivers if we shorten the day or shorten the route. Did I understand that correctly?
Absolutely, and it is the largest. It's the one thing that transportation supervisors lose sleep over countrywide, nationwide. Drivers, if we were awash with drivers, you wouldn't be seeing half the problems you see now. So that is the absolute biggest problem. Getting buses is just a matter of, excuse the way I put this, but the board voting for more buses.
Mm-hmm.
You see, getting drivers is going to be more difficult. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the recommendations, I believe, was, and again, you did respond to some of this, has to do with making it part of our contracts that contractors pay their drivers with cost of living increases and so forth that more closely match what's needed in this environment. I mean, it does sound to me like there's a series of questions here around the structure of funding bus drivers and transportation. It's right. The laws of the free market would suggest if you're not paying people enough to do the job, they're not going to do the job. And that's sort of a bigger issue, I think, that is as you say, is around the country. But I think needs to be taken into account here as something that's beyond necessarily the purview of, you know, us making our decisions around that, because that's a big issue that goes beyond the schools. So those are the first of my questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Arlotto. Mr. Douglas, Ms. McIntyre, it's nice to meet you both. I don't think we've met in my tenure so far. My first, I'm going to call these the questions, but I'm just curious. Was there a specific reason you picked Meade High School and that specific bus route?
Thank you. It's nice to meet you too. I actually was on the task force back in 2013, and I was a specialist for the Meade area. During that time, I had the Meade and the Rundle feeder for 19 years. So at that time, the information that you've been provided by Dr. Arlotto from 2013's report has a scenario in there that looks very similar. And I actually chose the Meade area because of the special needs that I had. That was Meade area has a lot of special ed services and programs. So I was able to sort of show the full effect of what buses do by choosing the Meade area. There's many other feeders, of course, the Verna Park and Southern and South River, but Meade was able to really capture back in 2013 what all the high school buses do. So that's why that was chosen. And this time I chose it as well. I'm not the area specialist for that area, but I went back and I pulled the whole Meade area and chose it again. It still has a lot of the special ed programs that's intertwined in all those routes.
Okay, and the specific route just because it met a lot of those needs?
Yes.
Okay.
Because it was able to show a 4-tier route. That's why that was chosen.
Great. Well, the reason I asked that is because that was my bus back in middle school. Yes. It was my bus back in middle school. And Miss Antoine, she's probably smiling too, because it was her son's bus when he was in middle school as well. We rode the same bus for a year.
Was your bus driver Miss Yvonne?
Was it? Miss Yvonne's more than a bus driver. She's a family friend.
Really? She's still there.
Yeah,
I know she's still a driver.
Shout out to Miss Yvonne.
Yes.
Best bus we probably have. We invited her to Thanksgiving one year, but I digress.
That's too funny.
I will say that a lot of things you were saying about the timing. I think Mr. Douglas was touching on the timing for those 10-minute intervals. I know what it's like when your bus is not on time for some, extenuating circumstance. And I just drawing back on my experiences, it just makes a lot of sense looking at it now, looking at the behind the scenes work to what I felt on the day to day. But one thing I felt that I think it was unique to me in high school was I played the trombone, was in the band. They called me Trombone Shorty, and I also played baseball. And in the springtime, oftentimes I would carry a trombone and a baseball bag, plus my backpack. And that's 3 bags to one person. So my question is, when we talk about busing, bus capacities, do we take that into account, what the students have to carry? I mean, we always want to foster extracurriculars, but sometimes extracurriculars, you have to carry an instrument. I can't imagine 3 students plus a tuba, or sometimes even just the science fair project. So do you take that into account? I know that's probably hard because, that just depends, but does that go into the busing when we make these routes?
We actually do not take that into consideration because the bus is there for the students. Our primary job is to transport students. We definitely will accommodate students that have instruments as long as they can hold it on their lap or at the base of their feet, or as long as it doesn't take the space that another student may need to be transported. So I take it that if you were able to take your instrument on there, that you had some extra space, maybe.
Yeah, I did.
to put it. But yes, we don't know who's playing instruments. And our job is to get students to and from, and we definitely will accommodate as long as there's space on the bus and they can hold it.
Okay, great. Because it was still tight, even though I had space. I think I hit a few of my neighbors on the head a few times. So
And bus drivers will do everything they can to get you on the bus with your instrument. So as long as there's space.
good. But and then my next question, it's kind of on the same wavelength as Dr. Tobin's, just about why we're in this situation. Seems to me a lack of buses, and that's probably for a number of reasons: lack of drivers, lack of funding. But in a perfect world, let's say just to fund to give at least one of the schools, let's say just for middle school, in a perfect world, how much money would it cost to give middle schools their own fleet of buses? Because I think if we can fund that, I think then we could move the times relatively easily, right?
Mr. Douglas, would you like?
Yeah, Les, before you answer, let me jump in, because I think I think you're getting Mr. Smith to a really important point, which is that you've heard the term the tiered system, and you've heard the folks talk about the efficiency of a bus. So if you have one bus, if you can get that bus to move a large number of students in a given day, then that bus is running efficiently, to use a term. By taking the tiered system, we're spreading that over 4 runs, one bus. So if it's a 3-tiered, depending on the cluster, and Ms. McIntyre chose that bus, your bus, interestingly enough, it is truly a small world, that we get the most efficiency out of a piece of equipment. That's the term the transportation folks use. You and I say it's a bus. We get the most efficiency out of that bus by running it multiple times in a day, in the morning and in the afternoon. Sort of what you're getting at, and Dr. Tobin sort of referenced it in her comment, is that from moving, say, from 3 tiers to 2, you still have the same number of students that you have to move to and from school. But you're going to have to do that. In order to do that with less tiers, you're going to have more buses. Which is, to your point, if we were to go out and purchase more buses, and keeping in mind for the board and the public listening in, we own very few buses as a school system. Some big school systems own hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buses. We own 55 or so buses that we use primarily for moving special education and non-public students, where our contractors, and I think there's roughly 19 of them, are responsible for moving the traditional students to and from schools, as well as others. So that's a really interesting point to make, is that when you reduce tiers from 3 to 2, you're just going to move the same number of students, you're going to have more buses in order to do that. Did I say that appropriately, Mr. Douglas? You're muted.
He's still muted.
Still muted.
Dr. Lotta, this is Alex. You did answer the question, and we've documented Mr. Drake Smith's question, and we'll run that calculation and provide it back to the board along with the other Q&As that require a follow-up response. So you'll get that, Mr. Smith, in terms of a Q&A response from us.
I appreciate it, Mr. Cheknovich. But also in that question, I didn't mean just us purchasing buses. I think I phrased it wrong. But to give middle schools or any school their own fleet to make everything else a lot easier. So if that requires another contractor, maybe another 2 contractors, and then of course all the salary implications along with that. It's not just the buying, but also just getting these buses to run, I guess. So if
that's the cost we'll give you. Back of the envelope, it's about $73,000 per bus. So think of how many buses are out there. It's $73,000 for every one of those, and that's every single year you're going to have to pay that. So, and And, back to Ms. Tobin's point, we are required, fortunately or unfortunately, right, we are obligated to take the lowest priced, responsible, and responsive bidder. So we are in a low bid kind of environment. That covers part of the dynamics. Certainly, we could potentially influence potentially the labor rates that the contractors are paying, but understand that those would be reflected in the bid price. We would need to telegraph that in advance, Ms. Tobin, as you can well appreciate. The contractors would then reflect that in their pricing structure, which means we would then have to go to the county government and seek however many millions dollars more, whatever it would take to fund those salary increases for the driver and aides. So it is a little bit of an involved dynamic. And we would have to balance the contracting law elements, Dr. Tobin, as well as the ability of the county government to absorb any additional price escalations as a result of those labor rates. And that then ties back to your point, Mr. Smith. But again, we'll run the answer, the calculations to answer your exact question and get it out. And if you don't feel we've hit the nail on the head, you let us know, and we can certainly expand on it for you.
Great, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the follow-up as always. But just to your point about the cost of living, just a personal anecdote. My grandfather, he used to drive buses for the county public schools, and he actually used to take my mother to and from Arundel High School, a number of her cousins. So I know that we want to make sure that the bus drivers, they have families too, and their families go on to do great things, as you can see. But so I do appreciate that. But I think that covers my questions now. My next few questions in the next round, they have to do with the sports and extracurriculars that Mr. Lehman and Mr. Colton were sharing. So I appreciate all the responses. And I guess it's Dr. Lowe, back to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And Mrs. Corkadell.
Thank you, and thanks so much to the staff. Mr. Smith, I'll just tell you from firsthand experience, Ms. McIntyre and I have walked Arundel and Meade bus stops back when I worked with the county, and she was my go-to person because she knows her turf. She knows the people in the communities by first name and knows how to solve a problem. So I just want to share that and miss working with you at that level, of course. I do have two questions. And the first one is actually, as I was listening to Mr. Culp, I was starting to hear things that seemed familiar to me, of recent familiarity as it related to the opportunity gap report and recommendations that we recently heard Dr. Arlotto and County Executive Pittman share with us. Particularly, and I don't know if this would be a Ms. Jackson, a Mr. Culp perhaps, and a little bit of Dr. McMahon built in perhaps, but page 11 of that has a goal that says increase access to and equitable representation in traditional and non-traditional after-school activities at all levels in partnership with the county and utilizing existing resources to broaden student interest and experiences with 5 recommended strategies. And as I was hearing that, it occurred to me that, we're talking about sports and extracurricular and the impact on that. And given, of course, the board's new policy on equity, and I don't think we necessarily needed a policy. I'm confident that each and every single member I work with and my colleagues always have equity in the eye spot. But perhaps in light of some of how we're now looking at this and what has transacted in the last several months on equity, and I think the progress we have potential of making, it seems to me that maybe we should be doing an equity analysis perhaps on some of the proposed changes before we do them. And so, Dr. Arlotto, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like hearing more on some of the, specifically, I guess, some of the recommendations Prismatic made and how we would perhaps put that through an appropriate equity lens to make sure that we're, the impact on extracurriculars, the impact on the sports, and other components, which I'll get to on my second question. Not necessarily tonight. It's kind of a mouthful, but I'm wondering, is that, it seems like it's appropriate. Could you maybe respond to that a little bit?
Yes, ma'am. I think it's a great point, and it's very appropriate. I think any changes that we make as a system that this board considers in any realm would needs, and to use your term, an equity analysis. That it is that all the decisions that we make, policy, regulatory language, or access to extra and co-curriculars, in this example, need to make sure that they go through an equity lens. And so I think that's important. How that relates to each of the prismatic recommendations, of course, I don't have any information for you on that this evening. But
bless you.
Thank you.
Bless you.
You bring a great point, that as we are continuing to look at this important issue, that we are looking at all of the tangential pieces to changing start and dismissal times, like athletics, like extra and co-curriculars, like childcare, transportation, all those things that we know will be impacted by a change in start times. We'll need to make sure that and have a very close look through the equity lens at each of those possible changes.
Thank you, and I'm really glad you mentioned something I forgot to mention, not because it wasn't on my mind, but just didn't make it when I said it, which was childcare too. And we know that the very same vulnerable populations and categories that we're talking about as it relates to reopening, and whether we're talking about reopening, the opportunity gap in general, or otherwise, childcare is pivotal, I believe, in just about every single one of those groups. So greatly appreciated. My second question is related to something in internships and jobs. And I know we didn't have the benefit tonight of like the community college or workforce development, but I'm wondering, as it relates to jobs, for example, we know our kids, that's how they prepare for their college tuition bills and the room and board. Unfortunately, for some families and some of our most economically vulnerable ones, it's how their family puts food on the table. And our internships are what open up doors and opportunities and give people a chance to demonstrate the chance for perhaps their grades and their other conditions to not reflect that. And so I'm wondering if we can get some feedback, not necessarily tonight, but some additional information before this board were to entertain any type of decision on those impacts. And it seems to me like the model that you used for sports and extracurricular would be a good way of demonstrating that, where you went through here's the conditions, and here's how many kids it's affecting, and here are the obstacles. I think it's important for us to know those obstacles so that we can address them one by one, so that we can have that positive impact that we seek in doing responsibly. But in general, recognizing that lack of preparation, could you perhaps speak a little bit about those impacts in general for right now on our student population?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. And we can do some further analysis for you and your colleagues on the board regarding the possible impacts on internships and jobs. I know that it was part of what the task force reviewed, and Dr. McMahon might want to share a little bit about what as her memory serves, and those impacts that were discussed, because we did have input from the community college. We did have input from workforce development as part of that work. I will say, I think there are those students that access internships and jobs during what we would call the traditional school day. In other words, they have a truncated school schedule where they might have their first and second period. And then after that second period class, they're going off to an internship, to a community college class, or to a job. And so there are those students where the start and dismissal times probably would not necessarily be highly impactful, because they've got a truncated on by choice high school schedule, so they could take advantage of a job, an internship, or a community college course. There will be some students who, however, that want to be involved in any one of those three things, jobs, internships, or the community college, but they must take a full schedule. They are, in order for them to focus first and foremost, which is our focus on them graduating on time, they may be having to take a more full schedule, if not a complete schedule, all 4 courses during the high school day. So the start and end time might have a larger impact on those students as they then leave school, possibly at a later time, to access an internship, a job, or community college course. All things that we would have to look at. Anything to add to that, Dr. McMahon?
I would agree with everything you said, Dr. Arlotto, and also include the notion that as many employers over the last 5 years have gone to flexible staffing and flexible work times, many of the business and industries are open till 5 and 6 p.m. So as long as the students don't get out too late, they can have 2 or 3 hours. An employer doesn't really want somebody to show up for 1 hour after school. They need a few hours. So what we're trying to do is increase the number of internships, as Dr. Arlotto articulated, during the school year to complement the internships we have during the summer. In the summertime, the students can work full time if they'd like. So we just have to be mindful as the hours get later, there is less opportunity for a student to work an in-person internship after the school day.
Okay. And do we provide any transportation for any of that stuff? Is there direct transportation or collaborative relationships that I'm missing? Just as a quick follow-up.
We work with the county to make sure the students understand the public busing situation, and some of them do avail themselves of that. We set up carpools for them. Sometimes the employer, although the students don't get paid for their internships, sometimes the employer will pay for transportation. And then we often, if we know a student is going to have transportation issues, we buddy them up with another student so that they're in a dual internship on the same hours, even if they're not in the same office. Good question.
A lot like our sports teams do when they know that there's some players who would love to play, but the parents' schedule don't accommodate clearly. And so that means then public transportation, you don't need to answer this. It's not really a question. So that tells me that in my district in particular, where in non-COVID environment, which is what I'm presuming here, because we're talking about public transit, of course, and that's not running in this environment. But when we do get back, I know that the limited transportation around here, whether we're talking about the Crofton to the Mark Station run, which would run effectively Crofton High School or Rundle High School up the corridor, and then the southern route. And these are the many routes that have been providing those opportunities. If public transit has shrunk there larger, the county's been backfilling. So it sounds like those start and stop times would also then be something we would want to be considerate of with our students, because some of them end as soon as rush hour ends, I believe, in those quantity of hours you're referring to. Thank you guys so much. I don't have, those are my questions. Thank you, Dr. Arlotto.
Yes, ma'am. Madam President, looking at the clock and we're nearing 9 o'clock. Would you like us to continue with another round of questions?
I believe that some of our members would benefit from one more round. So, and then of course, obviously, we also have to follow up with our log entry, and there'll be other opportunities, of course, in the near future. New president dependent, of course. So yes, if you wouldn't mind, I understand the lateness of the hour, but I also understand how important it is to have this conversation holistically as much as possible. And so I believe there was at least 3 or 4 board members who expressed an interest with a couple more questions. So I'll just request brevity and appreciation for the fact we do have a staff sitting at central office. So in that effort, we'd be there whether or not we had a longer presentation or a shorter one, because there's only so many hours you can go. So with that stated, Dr. Arlotto, please.
Yes, ma'am. We will continue. Mrs. Antwine.
Thank you, President Corkadale, for allowing the next round of questioning. But at this time, looking at the time and knowing that we'll all be together tomorrow night and the next night, I will digress on any questions that I have at this time. And I sincerely appreciate not only the work that you all have done for this particular workshop, but as Ms. Smith pointed out, my son greatly depended as a latchkey kid on this transportation being top notch, and you were. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Antwine. Mr. Silkworth.
I would like to thank all of the panelists for your help this evening. It's been very informative. And I really only have one question, and maybe that goes to Dr. McMahon, and that is, I think the change from 717 to 730 took place, was it 2017, some years ago. And just anecdotally, I've noticed myself that GPAs for a lot of our kids have really kind of been going up. And I just wonder if there's any data to suggest that maybe the reason for that was that change from 717 to 730. Dr. McMahon.
That's a good question, Mr. Silkworth. I think it correlates certainly in a positive way. We're not sure. There are so many variables going on, but I don't want to speak ill of the later start time. It could be easily a factor. We have a lot of things going on. We've put wraparound services in place. We have student services acting more aggressively towards making sure students are engaged. And we have many other academic supports in place. But the 13 minutes could have had a positive effect certainly as well.
I think it did. Thank you.
Thank you. And you were right, Mr. Silkworth. There were 10 minutes added to the entire day in the 2008-2009 school year. And then there was the shift to the later time at the high school level, 7:30 in the 2017-2018 year. Ms. Frank.
Hello, sorry. So I'm just going to push back a touch and just say, were there any behavioral issues noticed in the younger group at that same time frame because of the lack of playtime and the later starting hours, or do we have any of that data?
I don't in front of me. Dr. McMahon, I'm going to use the term, were discipline numbers looked at as part of the data, as part of the data set during the task force review and your work?
Right. During the task force, we looked in a small way at discipline. We did look at grades, and we did look nationally at what people were saying with respect to student engagement in the academics as well as the co-curricular world. So the notion of starting later and having less students who were sleepy in the morning and things like that, I mean, that was a positive. What we did see is that what the committee found in the research was that the earlier start times for elementary schools were looked at as a positive as opposed to a negative. So this notion of the way the committee ended up, that putting the students who get up earlier in a natural way and get rolling with their day in a natural way, which are our youngest students, to get them going would actually engage them, and then we would have less problems. And we didn't end up going that way, but that's what the committee found when they did their research.
Okay, thank you for that. And then just as a side comment, I do appreciate you guys taking all this time with me. I know that part of the reason it's probably so long is because we have, a lot of questions and we're kind of playing catch up a little bit. So And I do apologize to the other board members who are kind of have heard this perhaps before, but I do feel like I am learning a lot tonight, and I do appreciate it. I wanted to go back to Dr. Tobin's comments about just sort of addressing that there are some inefficiencies that have already been addressed. Can we get some updates on what you guys have looked at in this report and have already started to work on, and just show us, like, okay, I know that there were some staff hired. Can we sort of go by it item by item at some point, or just have a sheet that says, okay, this is in the works, this is already done, and just give us a broad overview of what's kind of happened behind the scenes too. And then additionally, you don't have to answer that now, but then additionally, I also wanted to get from Mr. Clayton just a request for this sports schedule, just a 1 week of one of the sports schedules, just to see how they're packed in visually. If somebody could send me that, just so I can kind of have an idea of how that would have to be worked around and how that's sort of set up. And then I don't have any other questions aside from that, but I do thank everybody very, very much.
Thank you, Ms. Frank, and Clayton, if you can get her some athletic schedules, if you would get those to Diane Howell, and then she'll post them for all the board members to see, so Ms. Frank and all her colleagues can see that. And then in your second piece that you mentioned, Ms. Frank, was sort of an I'm going to use my words, I'm paraphrasing, update to the prismatic recommendations. So a spreadsheet exists. It's been delivered to the board and updated. So Ms. Howell can get you access to that, so you can review each one of the recommendations and where we are in terms of implementation at this stage.
Okay, thank you. I would definitely be interested in that one. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Ellis.
Thank you. I want to touch on some things that Mr. Douglas was talking about, and I greatly appreciate, I don't want it to be misunderstood what I'm getting at, because Mr. Douglas has to look at this from a transportation perspective to try and keep our buses running efficiently and smoothly. But two things you mentioned, Mr. Douglas, was one was the tiers, and you gave like a specific example of number of students riding a bus to show how 4 tiers is more efficient than 3 tiers, because you could have more students served that way. And then you also mentioned the concern of attracting bus drivers if we were to reduce the number of hours drivers were working. I guess the concern, the implied concern is that they would that would be a reduction in their income. And so I just want to paint the picture of there's some tipping point where a bus isn't efficient if it's not serving our students' just natural needs. So if in a perfectly efficient bus scenario, based on what Mr. Douglas described, we could run 6 or 7 tiers and stagger our start times even more and have bus drivers working 8 hours a day, and fewer buses, because we would serve more students per bus that way. But obviously that's not going to happen. So I believe we are beyond the tipping point with our current operating procedures, where we're not effectively serving our students. But to the point of attracting bus drivers, if we were, let's say, to reduce the number of hours a driver was on the road from 5 to 6, yet met the recommendation of paying our drivers competitively at a competitive rate, I see a zero cost solution where a bus driver could be driving for 5 hours instead of 6, and therefore driving at a higher rate. That, of course, would not increase the annual income of a bus driver, but it might attract more people who perhaps, oh, I have 5 hours in a day where I can drive a bus for some extra money. So I see that as a potential recruiting effort if we were to make our buses more efficient and reducing the time that they're on the road. Does that make sense? Could you see that as a recruiting tool?
No, that makes perfect sense. I'm sorry, did somebody else want to answer this or not? I thought I heard another voice.
yes.
Okay, can I address your first issue? And I think maybe I didn't express myself correctly. When I was advocating the 4 instead of 3 tiers, I wasn't saying that 4 is always better than 3. What I was trying to get at is we want to judge each bus by how many students it serves. Sometimes if it serves 3 tiers and it's fuller, it might be serving more students than if it did 4 tiers and had fewer kids. So what I really wanted to say was we have to look at each bus individually, not just saying 4 tiers is always better than 3 or 6 is better than 4. So no, my only point was we want to look at the efficiency of the bus considering the whole route, not each trip. Okay? Looking at a trip and saying, there are only 20 kids on that bus. Well, it might have 3 other trips of 40 kids. So it really is. And quite frankly, the one that Wanda chose to look at, where there were 44 kids, 32, 55, and 31, it's 162 kids. It's averaging 40 kids per trip. That's anyone in the country will take that as an efficient bus. What Prismatic was talking about was looking at our fleet and seeing buses with 15 or 20 kids on it. Those are the ones, not so much the one that Wanda chose, but we have 15 and 20 kids on a bus. That's a serious efficiency issue. Now, the other issue with the labor market is, point well taken. If you're bringing home the same paycheck and working 5 hours as opposed to bringing home the same paycheck and working 6, that if you can find that balance, yeah, that might be a selling point. I don't know of anyone who has. Well, I just that's a tough problem, and I guess that's my answer to the two issues.
Thank you.
Certainly.
I'm not sure where I have so many questions about the childcare issue, but real quickly though, Mr. Anthony mentioned that 10 to 15% of their childcare workforce is high school students, but there was no number that came attached with that. So I know he's not here, but if we could get how many students that is, because I am curious how many of those positions could be filled with internships, considering, as Mr. Anthony mentioned, many of those students working in the childcare setting are students who have an interest in a career in education or some type of childcare. But following up on some of the things Dr. McMahon said that were very much, a lot of it was centered around the childcare issue, but also talked about co-curriculars and how shifting start times would cut into family time and push those activities into darkness. But as a board member, a lot of the concerns I hear about family time are from elementary parents. As a parent who's parented children from birth to college, well, two in high school now, I think it's pretty typical. I don't want to minimize the importance of family time in every family, because now that I have 3 teens and a young adult, it's precious time when we can all be together. But it changes a lot from the elementary years, and that family time as a daily experience, I think, is typically more important in those elementary years, because it's just not practiced as much when your teen is out playing sports and taking a job and all those other things. So when the childcare issue came up, I think it was stated that teens are often, parents count on their teens to be home to watch their younger children after they get off the bus. And while I do know that that happens, I guess my question is, should we be looking at other creative solutions there? Should the teens of Anne Arundel County be carrying the burden of childcare? And we all know right now, during COVID, now 9 months in, that all of our lives been turned upside down. And we've all had to find creative solutions for things. And we know that childcare is a big one during these days of COVID. But when we are looking at getting back into the schools, I think we need to keep being creative, and should not place that burden on the shoulders of every teen in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Can you talk about that a little bit, Dr. McMahon, about the potential for looking at other solutions?
Sure. I think you're right, Mrs. Ellis, that we have to look for other solutions. I was just bringing up the notion that we were hit really hard by the fact that childcare is not something that's easily accessible by all in Anne Arundel County. Sometimes that's because the cost of good childcare can be high for many families. Sometimes it's because of where you live in the county. There isn't easily accessible childcare where students actually can take a bus or get a ride from somebody to it, depending on where they live. That's especially true in southern Anne Arundel County, and somewhat true in the west, and somewhat true in the north. Central part of the county is a little bit more richly endowed with childcare facilities that are larger. In many of the other parts of the county, they rely on family friends, neighbors, and their children to take care of their younger children. We heard that time and again, and we even heard it from the small daycare providers. We called about 70 to 100 different daycare providers, some of them who are licensed to hold less than 8 people in their in their homes as a daycare facility. And there's a license for less than 8, there's a license for less than 12. And so we made hundreds of phone calls. We heard story after story after story. And then in the survey, when it went out, when we asked for emails, we got all kinds of emails about don't forget, and then the story would unwind. Don't forget us, don't forget why and what links we go to get good childcare. So I just wanted to bring that to the board's attention, that it was much more complex an issue than we initially thought. That's all. Do I think it's able to be overcome? Sure, but it will mean much more creative solutions than we initially thought.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Thank you, Ms. Ellis. Ms. Schulheim.
Yes, thank you. So I have just some comments first, and then two quick questions. So with regard to equity, I loved that what Mrs. Corkadell brought up, and I think that when we do this evaluation of equity in terms of changes we make to our current system, we should also view our current system, our current start times through that same equity lens and do a comparison of the two, because if we're going to talk about childcare, then we should talk about really late starting elementary schools, some of which are Title I, some of which have parents who report for PT on post at 6 a.m. and have to be in childcare from 6 a.m. until their 9:40 start time, and the equity around that, very small children up very early, yes, but going to school, almost 4 hours into their day, spending from the testimony I revisited back in April 2017, y'all should watch it, from when the then principal of Mead Heights and a few parents testified, was a really big problem, keeping kids out of their homes for, once you do the morning childcare, the school day, the after school programming, about 12 hours. I know Mr. Silkworth, you were there that night, so you'll recall that from April 2017. So I want us to make sure we understand the current landscape of childcare and the current problems that childcare before care facilities have in hiring staffing for before care, especially when when we talk about the really late starting elementary schools. It's my understanding from talking to folks that's hard to staff as well, and so that's a current issue there. And to address family time, it's very hard to have equitable after school co-curricular participation and family time when you're getting off the bus at 4:30, 4:45, 5 o'clock p.m. And that's the case for if not some, darn near all of our very late starting elementary schools. And then there's the equity about in the providing of before school clubs, and if those are equally accessible by all of our students. So we need to look at that equity lens, not just with any proposed changes, but with our current system. And I feel very strongly about that. So I hope that's been jot down. With regard to the buses and tiering, yes, I can see your point, Mr. Douglas, about the efficiency, but trips takes time, and time is what's at stake. And so I want us to hopefully think outside the box, think creatively about this, because the report pointed out a fair number of inefficiencies when it regards to routing our buses, and I would give up a few extra children that bus transports in the morning if their time is used better, if our time is used better, and especially with regard to the focus of tonight is start times and dismissal times. I also want to point out the health and safety again. So we've been following the CDC guidelines with regard to COVID, but we're not with regard to start times. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, of course, put out the 8:30 or later for middle and high school, and that was also adopted by the CDC 1 year later in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. And then I want to point out also with regards to grades and behavior as it relates to sleep, there's a ton of data out there. All you got to do is Google it. Y'all should too. And there is a lot of data out there when it talks about more sleep in high school students, middle school students, and its effect on test scores, on grades, on behavior, on all of those things. So now to my question, how are we, it's my understanding that, and yes, I know we need time to make some changes, but as I heard on Dr. Alato's weekly announcement last week, that, and what I knew previously, that when we go back to a hybrid model, should the metrics allow, that we would just hop back to what we had before the status quo, which doesn't work for me any longer, especially with the prismatic report. And so I'm wondering, Mr. Douglas, what efficiencies are you looking at straight out of the gate? And this is not necessarily a start times question, but a routing and efficiency question for when we go back. It was my understanding that we had to do all the old bus stops as we had them. And so I'm wondering, surely there are ways to make this better, even without a start times implication. Are you planning on having students opt in? Are you planning on making changes to that routing straight out of the gate when we go back for hybrid? If you can speak to that, please.
Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're restricting the bus to one student per seat, which is going to cut us down to, depending on how many rows are in the bus, 21 to 25 students on the bus, as opposed to 40. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Now, and it's really going to be based on the questionnaires as to who's going to decide to go back into school, who's going to decide to use the school bus, because there's a portion of folks who are going to say, we're concerned from health reasons with our student being on the school bus, with there being one student in each seat. So we're really working, giving the most effort to social distancing, first of all. And this is borne out with almost every single school system that we speak with, that we consult with, is that the best thing to do is keep the routes as they are, and cut down on the number of students. Obviously, there's going to be A students and B students, those are going on Monday and Tuesday, those going on Thursday and Friday. We're looking primarily at keeping the buses sanitized and working on the social distancing. So that's
okay. So there's no movement as to bus stops, assignment of students to buses, recrafting routes based on survey results, or I see some immediate things we can do without, I'm so far off the start times issue right now, even talking about this, because the focus of tonight is start times, but I see opportunities, and I hope that we take advantage of all of those things as we go forward, as they were sort of pointed out in that 150-page report, and then and with the increase of staff and some time and space since March to think about what's in the report. I just hope that we don't waste mileage, gas, time, etc. I think there's things you can do straight out of the gate. I just encourage you to think about that and to do so. I think that was all that I had at this moment. Thank you so much for your time.
certainly.
Thank you, Ms. Schulheim. Dr. Tobin.
Thank you. I hope a couple of fairly quick questions. I would like some, and I'll ask it as maybe follow-up I can get later, not to take too much time here. I'm a little confused, and I did actually look at the sheet or the spreadsheet that has the transportation departments and other groups updates on the different recommendations from the Prismatic report. I'm a little perplexed by some of the recommendations around, or rather the responses to some of the recommendations 3 and 7, which have to do with human resources and working with the human resources department or hiring an administrative specialist within the transportation department to oversee some of the hiring processes. So again, maybe tonight is not the time to get into all those details, but I'd like to have a follow-up discussion about that to make sure that I understand how that interaction is working, because it does seem to me underneath all of this is making sure that not only the efficiencies are found within the transportation department, but that the working across departments that was part of the Prismatic report is happening in a smooth fashion, and understanding better if there are issues there we need to take into account. So as I said, I'd love some later follow-up on that, unless Mr. Douglas would like to jump in now.
Can you be a little more specific as to what your concerns are
Well,
with the
yeah.
HR?
So I will say that there is a question around recommendation 7 with regard to writing pay rules and salary rules. The response, as I read it, was essentially sort of a question about who has the jurisdiction to make those decisions. And it wasn't clear to me there was an answer to that. And so, as I said, this may be more detailed than we want to get into tonight, but I'd just like some clarification on that at some point as to finally who is going to make that decision, and if it's, you know, if there's a smooth understanding of what the various positions are, and that we're actually being consistent in having those pay structures in place in the transportation department. So that was one of the issues I was curious about. And there was also in recommendation 3 a discussion of the hiring and onboarding process really essentially being handled by a manager in the transportation department, and the need to hire a new position for that. And I believe the response stated that there was a decision not to hire that person, and that HR would continue to do the work, which is exactly not what I understood Prismatic to be saying. So I was confused about that, and I'd just like that to be clarified, if possible. So
Yeah, I think we can clarify, and I'm not sure that tonight's the night.
yeah. So that's what I said. The other is a much bigger question, and to some extent, it's related to some of the things Ms. Ellis brought up, sort of broadly around what our priorities are, and how to make those priorities clear. And one of the things that has struck me in listening tonight to the presentations from the various panelists is that AACPS has been struggling to sort of put things together within a bunch of different constraints around this issue for a long time. And one of those seems to me to be very clearly the fact that we share our sports facilities with the county, which was pointed out, I believe, by Mr. Culp as being something unusual about this county. And it seems to me that, at the very least, I have a question as to when, how, and why we decided to share facilities, and, what the value of that is. And my broader thinking is, I mean, we as board members do have to make a leadership decision here. And as with all leadership decisions, those decisions need to be in alignment with our mission and vision as a school system. And essential to that is, first and foremost, the well-being of our students that will enable them to grow into the healthy, productive, fulfilled, functioning human beings that can contribute to their society. And so sleep is obviously crucial. Their ability to care for themselves is crucial. Their ability to trust that the adults making the decisions about them are doing so with an eye to what's in the best interests of their health and their basic needs, because that's the ground on which any learning, academic excellence, all of those things will finally occur. And so it seems to me at some point we have to ask questions like why we should have our students bear the burden of the fact that their high school fields aren't their own except for a few hours a day. That obviously involves entities I would assume, outside of the school system. But it seems to me that that's a foundational question that might be worth returning to at this point as we think this through, because problem solving, which is what we purport to teach our students to do, is what we obviously have to do. And that sometimes means upending old assumptions about what will work. So I lay that out there as a newbie here, because that's what smacks me in the forehead as I listen to this. What is our priority? What should be our priority? And what is something that maybe is pushing, we've reached a point, just isn't the best situation for our students. And that is a question I have as I listen to this tonight. So I don't know if Dr. Olato, you want to respond to that?
I'm going to start, and then Mr. Sheknovich, I know, can give you some history and some other important information regarding. And so, as you so eloquently did, Dr. Tobin, this is a consideration for the board to take in this is a variable for the board to take into consideration. It is, and that's the reason it was so discussed in depth during the process of the task force, and then again brought to this board for your consideration, because you're right, at some point, as you talked about, I think you used the term leadership, and making a decision. So it will be a decision with a consideration for that variable. I will say that what I would not want to get lost, and we'll talk about this further, I'm sure, is that in talking about scheduling the high school fields, because that's where Rex and Park uses our fields, or at the high school level. Of course, if you start later and you end later, you've got less time in the evenings for access for Rex and Park. Well, we can still have access for the high school students because we always have first right of refusal to our fields, right? So if I'm going to make this up, a field hockey game got canceled on a Tuesday and we had to replay it on a Wednesday night, we may have to bump recreation and parks, and they know that. Our students get first dibs. But what it should not get lost is the plethora of students of our students that are not high school students that utilize those fields under the guise of recreation and parks, right? So I don't want to lose that it's not just that we can gain access for the high school students, but less time for recreation and parks means less time for our students that are not high school students, if that makes sense. And with that, I think Mr. Sheknovich may have something to add.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Olato. And Dr. Tobin, to your point, it really does, to some extent, come down to maximizing the taxpayer's investment. This has been studied before. In fact, there was a county executive and paneled commission that was put together about 4 years ago. I believe, Ms. Corkadell, you were on it, along with Rec and Parks and DPW, a couple others to study the
Yes.
exact thing. But if you own a piece of property, you have to buy the property, right? The taxpayer has to buy the property and develop that piece of property and then maintain it. The more hours per day of use you can get out of that investment from the taxpayer's financial perspective, essentially, you are maximizing that capital investment. And so the system that we have essentially in this county, the decisions we've made, and Dr. Tobin, this is a 40, 50-year generational decision, right? We're living through the legacy of these decisions that hopefully you can well appreciate. But the decisions that were made in this county were to not duplicate resources. And by that, here's what I mean. The county overinvests, and I can go into this further at another time. The county actually overinvests in our school facilities. We have larger gyms in many of our schools than than we need. So we actually built a middle school sized gym on our elementary schools. The county pays for that knowing that the incremental costs of having them pay for our gym to be a little bit bigger to meet both our students at the elementary schools, but also have the same gym be used by both youth and adult leagues off hours is more efficient than Rec and Parks having to buy their own piece of land, build their own gym, heat and cool that gym, cut the grass around that gym, maintain the parking lot, etc., for events that are sort of counter-cyclical. So our demand is during the day because the bulk of the students are in school. Rec and Parks has no demand during the day. You see what I'm saying? But when our schools let out and when our athletes get out of school, that demand is transferred to Rec and Parks, but we co-locate on that one piece of property with that one piece of infrastructure. And again, the upfront capital investments are less, the ongoing operation, maintenance, care and feeding of that facility is less. But that again is a strategic decision that this county made. Counties around us, Dr. Tobin, as Mr. Anthony alluded to, and Clayton alluded to as well, counties made different decisions. And if you go to Howard or Montgomery or Prince George's, they made different decisions. They own different assets, but that is because of the decision they've made over a 50-year span of time that we here in this county elected not to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Sheknovich. And that was my surmise, that was essentially the sort of thinking. And I guess what I would add to that then, and thank you for laying it out for me, is again, as a leadership decision, I think we as a board now have to weigh, what the real, how we're best going to advocate for our students. Because the truth is that while that's a very efficient use of resources, that space, and there's certainly a logic to it that I can follow. Again, if we've reached a tipping point where we're making decisions about whether students get enough sleep or don't, based on maximizing these facilities, that seems to me a backwards decision with regard to our vision and our mission as an educational institution, right? And so, and that's just to say, that's what we're going to have to weigh, because, education is the most human of institutions, and we are talking about human beings and their developmental potential and meeting their developmental needs, which is our first job. So, I think that is a legacy decision that we're living with now. And clearly, Mr. Culp and Mr. Lehman and so many others are working extremely hard and will continue to work extremely hard to be creative within that that structure, but it's been stretched thin. We do have school days that are longer now. We do have a different set of circumstances than we had when some of those legacy decisions were made. So it just may be something we need to consider. So thank you for that information. That was really helpful. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tobin. Mr. Smith.
Me already? But I wore my, I guess, regular student hat, but now to put on my student athlete hat, I have a few questions for Mr. Colt and Mr. Lehman, or anyone who can answer them. I think going back to the whole think outside of the box type of mindset. First, I want to touch on what Dr. Tobin was saying about, I guess, taking away who has access to our fields. But could we boost who has access to our fields? Does Rec and Parks do they have access to our middle school facilities as well? I know they're not as nice and they might not have the lights, but to play a ball game, all you need is an empty field and not a lot of cars nearby. And I know a lot of our middle schools have that and they're pretty easily accessible. So do they have access to those facilities as well on a regular basis at the middle school or even the elementary school level?
Yeah, thanks, Drake. They do utilize, Rec and Parks utilizes the middle school and elementary school gymnasiums quite a bit for indoor activity that they sponsor. To some degree, the outdoor spaces, but it's nowhere near the level of the high school outdoor spaces. There's some different reasons for that I'm aware of. The upkeep and the activity level at the high school in terms of facilities and grounds and upkeep and ensuring that those spaces are maintained is definitely different than it is at the middle school and elementary school level in terms of what needs to be a playable space for games. But in terms of the gymnasium, the indoor spaces are very much used at those levels, at middle and elementary school.
Okay, and I guess a follow-up to that, I'm thinking of my own school, Meade High School, where, stone's throw away from Meade Middle School. You talked about how we may have 4 teams in the gym on one day, right? You have some teams starting practice at 9 p.m. And then we talked about how our gyms in some elementary schools are graded for a middle school. So I assume, looking back at MacArthur, I think the gym was pretty big. It's probably graded for a high school. Can we transfer some of the high school teams over to the middle schools to practice? Because those gyms, to my assumption, most of the time, they're probably empty after school.
So the answer to that, the short answer is yes, and we do that in some regard already. It's all part of the school timing issue, right? And if the middle school gets out later than the high school in the format that we're in right now, we couldn't necessarily have an initial time slot right after school, but possibly like the 5 p.m. team that might come in. And that does happen at some of our facilities where there's close proximity between the high school and the middle school. There are some practices that we will go to. And that also occurs in times where there's other facility issues happening at the high school level or something that's not working well or a different activity that's going on in the high school gym. We'll take advantage of that as well.
Okay, and I also want to point out in the conversation we're having, I think we failed to mention that some schools, they might use their cafeterias as a practice spot. I remember a number of times when it was raining, the baseball team would pick up all the tables in the cafeteria and use the cafeteria to field grounders. So just for public knowledge and my rest of my fellow board members, it's just sometimes a little small nuances you get as being a student athlete. But then I just want to ask, I think this might be a question you might have to follow up on with the log, but and then also for the interest of time, so if you just get back to me in the board with these answers, just how much would it cost to get two turf fields at every school at least? I think Northeast, they have like 3, but I know Meade only have 1. So how much would it cost to, get every school at least 2 turf fields? How much does it cost to light a field adequately? Not like build a whole new stadium, but just give it adequate light after it turns dark. And then I guess how much would it cost to, you said something about the bocce fields, or like a bocce court. How much would those cost to install? Because I'm not too familiar with bocce. I've been to one game. It was Chesapeake versus Meade, but it's rolling the ball. So I think you just need like a kind of like a flat piece of land. If we can just free up some space, I think that would go a long way as well. And then just while we're at it, how much would it cost to put a turf field at some of the middle schools? Maybe where Parks and Rec would be more inclined to use those instead of just always the high school. those are some of my thinking outside the box questions, and I think that's it. I just think, I'm very passionate about the sports, not just because I played them, I got so much out of them, but I just know how much they add to the community. And I think it's a shame that I think, we should be able to have both. I know we want students to have that sleep aspect, but they should also be able to have that play aspect. We talk about play at the elementary level, but this is play at the high school level. And then also I want to touch on the whole, I guess, job aspect. And I don't think this is Mr. Culp's problem. I think this is for the transportation. Is it possible? I think I know the answer in my head, but just to have more buses in the morning so we can accommodate these later start times than in the and then go back to, like, I guess, normal, less buses in the afternoon. So like double up the buses in the morning, then have an average amount of buses in the afternoon. Is that possible?
Well, it's possible, but you'd be wasting equipment. You'd be,
Okay.
it's just, we would get slammed for wasting equipment. If we bought 900 buses to use in the morning and we only use 450 of them in the afternoon, it's just it's not responsible use of taxpayer dollars.
And this is true. And but what about contracting just for the morning? Contracting more just for the morning?
They still have to buy the bus. I mean, we have to pay the contractor for that piece of equipment. So.
Okay. No, I appreciate that, Mr. Douglas. I think that pretty much wraps up all my questions. I also just want to touch on students and work experiences. Students really value those jobs, on the job training. Arguably, you might learn more. I mean, from my time in the Board of Education, you could say this is the best internship in the entire county. You just learn so much, and I know students at time and time again, especially with the NSA internship we have at Meade, they really value that. And I would not want to have to take that away to provide more sleep. I think it goes back to a thing where we just have to think outside the box just to still provide both, at some adequate level. And I also want to say, students with their jobs, I'm not trying to be funny, but most students, if you put less time at work to make money or more time to sleep, 8 times out of 10, I think they're going to pick more time at work, just because there's this new phrase that you probably heard of, chase the bag. That means get your money up. But so just more things to think about from, I guess, a student perspective. Students want to chase that bag, get their money up. But those are all my questions and concerns. I look forward to those responses from Mr. Culp sometime in the near future. So I want to thank you all for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And Ms. Corkadell.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions at this time. Thank you so very much. I'll definitely shoot over to the staff and others if I do. We are approaching the 10 o'clock hour though. So I think 2 hours over the published time probably is a practical and considerate thing for the staff and everyone. So if everyone's okay with it, I'd like to wrap this up now and give everybody a chance. We have 3 nights in a row, and so I do have a couple announcements to make. Is tomorrow night at 5 p.m. we will be meeting via audio, and you can visit aacps.org or to immediately vote to go into closed session. And then on Wednesday evening, weather permitting, of course, we will be having our public board meeting that will be starting at 6 p.m. with, prior to that, the policy committee at 2:30 and the budget committee meeting at, Melissa's at 4:30 or 4:45, right? 4:45.
Yes, 4:45. Sorry, I couldn't find that mute button.
No worries at all. So please visit our website for more information. And I want to thank everyone once again for everything. And Dr. Alato, is there any closing comments that you or the staff would like to make at this point?
Simply just where I began, thank you for the opportunity. It's great to welcome the new board members. I'm sorry for such a lengthy evening, but nonetheless, we tried to share as much what we think is useful information as possible. As you consider, these are all variables for the board to consider as we move together collaboratively to make some decisions about the start and dismissal times. So we're very appreciative of the time, Madam President.
Thank you. And I know members may have additional questions. I'll just ask that they please use the log. And Diane, I believe, has already emailed everyone to get with her on that. And that way, all of us can share that information. And of course, lastly, I want to announce the public hearing coming up on this very same topic. And Dr. Arlotta, I greatly appreciate it. I know that your staff also tried your best to incorporate constituent questions that we've been receiving over the last several months on this as it related. And so the public hearing is going to be the upcoming Monday night, week from tonight. And we're going to do it the same style we did in the end of October on a public hearing. We will have several hours of testimony. We do have to limit it to 100 people, and we will facilitate that in accordance and very similarly. So looking forward to that. So anyone having an interest can submit written testimony, of course, to the board following similar procedures that are going to be laid out, as well as sign up. So thank you all so much, and I greatly appreciate the additional time. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we'll be back here again tomorrow evening and the night after that, and a couple of days after. Busy, but very important work. Thank you all so very much. Have a good night.